I needed $5,600 for cancer surgery. When I called my son, the wealthy real estate CEO whose Ivy League education I paid for with my blood and sweat, he laughed over the sound of clinking champagne glasses. Dad, I just closed a $20 million deal. All my capital is tied up. Figure it out yourself. I sat in my freezing car waiting for the end until a knock on my window changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the person you sacrificed everything for. My name is Nelson Holloway. I am 69 years old. The piece of paper trembling in my weathered hands felt heavier than any weapon I ever carried during my time in the military. Prostate cancer. The words were printed in cold black ink staring back at me under the dim, flickering dome light of my 20-year-old sedan. But it was not the diagnosis that was making my chest tight and my breath shallow. It was the second piece of paper attached to it, the hospital bill. Because of my basic insurance plan, my out-of-pocket deductible required upfront before they would even schedule the life-saving surgery was $5,600. For a man living on a modest pension trying to stretch every single dollar just to keep the heat on and the refrigerator stocked, $5,600 might as well have been $1 million. I rubbed my aching eyes and looked out at the pouring rain hitting the windshield. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone screen. I had always been a proud man. I had never asked for a handout in my entire life. But this was not about pride anymore. This was about survival. I pulled up my contacts and stared at the name at the very top of my favorites list. Cameron, my son, the brilliant, untouchable CEO of a premier real estate development firm. I took a deep, ragged breath, swallowing the last ounce of my dignity, and pressed the call button. As the phone rang, echoing in the quiet, damp interior of my car, my mind drifted back through the decades. I remembered the exact moment I took off my army uniform for the last time. I had a promising military career ahead of me, but when my wife passed away, unexpectedly leaving me as a single father to 2 young children, I knew I had to make a choice. I traded my military boots for a postal worker uniform. I worked the grueling night shifts, sorting heavy bags of mail until my fingers bled and my back screamed in absolute agony, just so I could be there to make breakfast for Cameron and his younger sister Alicia before they went to school. But Cameron, he was always my main focus. My shining star. He was so incredibly smart, and I was determined that he would not inherit my life of endless manual labor. I skipped meals so he could eat. I wore boots with holes in the soles through freezing winters so he could have new sneakers. I sold my grandfather's antique watch, my only heirloom. I funneled every single spare cent into a college fund for him while ignoring Alicia's struggles. When he got accepted into a prestigious Ivy League university, I took out a second mortgage on my small house just to make sure his tuition was paid in full. I wanted him to conquer the world, and he did. He became a titan in the corporate world, driving imported luxury cars and living in a sprawling gated mansion. I gave him the world, sacrificing my own youth and comfort to build the foundation for his empire. The phone kept ringing, pulling me back to the cold reality of my freezing sedan. He was my son. I had given him everything. Surely a man who wore custom-tailored suits and dined at exclusive country clubs could spare a fraction of his wealth to save his father's life. The ringing finally stopped, replaced immediately by the deafening thumping of heavy bass and the loud chatter of a crowded room. "Cameron," I said, my voice cracking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. "It is Dad. I really need to talk to you. It is a medical emergency." "Dad." "Hold on, I can barely hear you," Cameron yelled into the receiver. The sound of clinking glasses and raucous laughter flooded through the speaker, drowning out his voice. "Listen, you need to make it quick. We are popping champagne over here. I just closed the absolute biggest deal of my entire career. A $20 million commercial complex right in the heart of the city." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming noise of his massive success. "Cameron, I was at the hospital today. The doctor gave me some terrible news. It is cancer. Prostate cancer." The music in the background seemed to get even louder. There was a slight pause on his end, but no gasp, no immediate concern. Just a heavy, impatient sigh that cut me deeper than the diagnosis itself. Cancer look. "Dad, I am sorry to hear that. I really am. But what exactly do you expect me to do about it right now? I have wealthy investors waiting for a toast." My heart shattered into a million sharp pieces. The absolute lack of empathy in his tone was suffocating. "I need surgery, Cameron. Very soon. But my insurance requires a $5,600 deductible upfront before they will even reserve the operating room. I do not have it. My pension barely covers groceries. I need your help, son. Please. It is literally a matter of life and death. $5,600. Cameron scoffed, his voice dripping with sudden intense irritation. Dad, are you kidding me right now? You are calling to ask me for almost $6,000 while I am in the middle of trying to celebrate a massive corporate victory. I just told you I closed a $20 million project. Do you have any idea what that means in the real world? It means every single liquid asset, every line of credit, every dime of my capital is tied up in development costs and escrow accounts. Cameron, please. I begged, the tears finally spilling over my wrinkled cheeks, hot and bitter. It is just $5,000. You spend that on a weekend getaway with your wife. You wear watches that cost 3 times that amount. I am your father. I gave up everything for you, and I am a businessman. He snapped back, his voice turning ice cold and ruthless. I am not a charity, Dad. I cannot just pull capital out of thin air because you failed to plan your retirement properly and did not save for a rainy day. Look, call the social services office tomorrow. See if you qualify for some government assistance program or set up a payment plan with the hospital. I have to get back to my guests before they think I am ignoring them. There is no money for you, Dad. Figure it out yourself. The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a flat line on a heart monitor. I sat there in the suffocating silence of my car, the phone slipping from my numb fingers and tumbling onto the passenger seat. The world around me seemed to stop spinning entirely. The son I had poured my entire life into, the boy I had starved for, had just sentenced me to death so he could go back to drinking expensive champagne with strangers. The crushing weight of my own foolishness pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I had bet my entire life on the wrong child. I buried my face in my calloused hands and let out a broken, agonizing sob that shook my entire body. Suddenly, a frantic, heavy knocking on my car window jolted me upright. I quickly wiped my wet eyes and peered through the rain-streaked glass, squinting into the dark night. Standing there in the pouring rain, shivering violently in her thin, worn-out nursing scrubs, was my daughter Alicia. The daughter I had always pushed aside to prioritize her brother. The daughter who was always struggling to make ends meet. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and her natural hair was plastered to her face by the relentless storm. But what caught my attention was not the cold rain soaking her through. It was her trembling hands pressed flat against the glass, holding a thick, crumpled white envelope. I pushed the unlock button, and Alicia yanked the passenger door open, bringing a gust of freezing wind and rain into the cramped car. She collapsed into the seat next to me, her breathing ragged, her teeth chattering so hard I could hear the sound over the storm outside. Without saying a single word of greeting, she shoved the damp, crumpled white envelope directly into my chest. I stared at it confused before my shaking fingers peeled back the torn paper flap. Inside was a thick, chaotic stack of cash. There were worn $20 bills folded, tens, a handful of fives, and a few crisp hundreds scattered throughout. I pulled the money out, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of it. I counted it quickly. $3,000. Alicia. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get this kind of money? She wiped the rain from her eyes with the back of her sleeve and looked at me with a fierce, unwavering gaze. I sold the car, Dad. I took it to that used auto lot on 5th Street and took their first cash offer. My stomach plummeted. Her car. The beat-up, reliable little sedan she used to drive my 2 teenage grandsons to school before rushing to her grueling night shifts at the hospital. I knew she had been saving every spare penny for months to pay off the boys' overdue tuition fees. She had been terrified they would be kicked out of school, and she had just liquidated her only mode of transportation to hand the cash to me. Looking at my daughter shivering in her faded, threadbare nursing scrubs, a suffocating wave of guilt crashed over me. Alicia had always been the one left behind. While I poured every ounce of my energy, my pride, and my paycheck into Cameron's future, Alicia was forced to figure life out entirely on her own. I paid for Cameron's private tutors, but I missed Alicia's high school graduation because I picked up an extra graveyard shift at the post office to cover Cameron's fraternity dues. I bought Cameron his first car while Alicia rode the city bus for years, and the worst part was how Cameron and his wife treated her. Melanie, my wealthy white daughter-in-law, never missed an opportunity to deliver a backhanded compliment. At the few family dinners we actually attended, Melanie would sip her imported wine and make snide remarks about Alicia's neighborhood. She would offer Alicia her old discarded designer clothes with a condescending smile, calling it charity. Cameron would just sit there swirling his scotch, looking at his own sister, as if she were a total failure who just did not work hard enough. They mocked her struggles. They treated her like a second-class citizen in her own family, yet here she was. The daughter I had neglected, sitting in a freezing car, handing over her entire lifeline to save a father who had prioritized the son who just told him to drop dead. The realization felt like a physical blow to my gut. The absolute injustice of it all burned my throat. I had spent my entire life investing in a ruthless businessman only to be rescued by an angel wearing cheap scrubs. I shoved the cash back into the envelope and tried to force it back into her hands. Alicia, I cannot take this. You need this money for the boys' tuition. If you do not pay the school by Friday, they will lose their enrollment. And how are you supposed to get to the hospital for your night shifts without a car? You cannot ride the bus at 2 in the morning in that neighborhood. Take it back right now. Alicia slapped my hands away, her eyes flashing with a sudden intense anger I had never seen from her before. She leaned across the center console, grabbing me by the shoulders of my old coat. You listen to me, Nelson Holloway, she commanded, her voice rising above the sound of the rain, cracking with raw emotion. You are not allowed to die. Do you hear me? You are not going to leave me here alone. I will take the damn bus. I will work double shifts at the hospital until my feet bleed. I will borrow the rest of the money from the payday loan office down the street if I have to. But you are getting this surgery, Dad. I do not care what it takes. The sheer force of her love broke whatever composure I had left. The dam inside me shattered completely. I pulled my daughter into my arms, burying my face in her wet shoulder, crying tears of profound shame and overwhelming gratitude. She held me tightly, rocking me back and forth, just like I used to do when she was a little girl. In that small, cramped space surrounded by the storm, a powerful shift occurred inside my soul. I finally accepted the damp envelope from her hands. But as my fingers closed around the cash, I made a silent, ironclad vow to myself. I would not just survive this cancer. I would live to see Alicia properly rewarded. I would pay her back 100 times over. I would make sure she never had to work another grueling night shift, and I would make sure her boys had the best education money could buy. I wiped my face, told her to go home and get warm, and promised her I would handle the rest of the hospital deposit. After watching her safely board the late-night city bus, I drove back to my modest single-story house. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty. I walked through the front door, feeling a new sense of purpose pulsing through my veins. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. I pushed aside the heavy oak nightstand and pulled back the corner of the worn-out area rug. Beneath the floorboards was a heavy steel safe I had installed decades ago. I knelt on the floor, my calloused fingers gripping the cold metal dial. I carefully spun the combination. 4, 17, 32. The heavy internal tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying metallic thud. I grabbed the handle and pulled the thick steel door upward. Just as the hinges groaned open, revealing the dark interior of the safe, my cell phone buzzed violently in my jacket pocket. The sudden noise made me jump. I pulled the phone out, expecting it to be a text from Alicia confirming she had made it home safely. Instead, the screen displayed an automated message from the National Bank where I kept my small checking account. I opened the notification and read the text. Urgent notice from Apex Financial. Foreclosure proceedings have been officially initiated on your property. Your account is currently 3 months past due on mortgage payments. Immediate action is required to prevent the seizure of this asset. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again, completely paralyzed by confusion and a sudden creeping sense of dread. Foreclosure mortgage payments. I spoke the words aloud to the empty room, my voice echoing off the walls. I bought this house in cash 30 years ago. I have the original deed sitting right here in this safe. I have never taken out a mortgage on this house in my entire life. The next morning, I did not go back to the hospital. I did not go to the pharmacy to pick up my pain medications. I drove my old sedan straight to the downtown branch of Apex Financial. I stood outside the heavy glass doors in the biting cold, waiting for the digital clock inside to strike 9. The moment the security guard unlocked the entrance, I marched directly to the branch manager's office. Mr. Henderson, a man I had known for over a decade, looked up from his desk with genuine surprise. I slammed my phone down on his polished mahogany desk, the foreclosure notification glaring brightly on the screen. I demanded an immediate explanation. I have owned my home outright for 30 years. I told him, my voice dangerously low and steady. I have never missed a single property tax payment. Why is your bank threatening to seize my property by the end of the month? Mr. Henderson nervously adjusted his glasses, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled up my file. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Nelson, he said hesitantly, our records show a home equity line of credit was taken out against your property exactly 3 years ago. The outstanding balance is $150,000, and no payments have been made for the last 90 days. The air in the room vanished. $150,000. I demanded to see the original paperwork. Henderson printed out the loan agreement and slid it across the desk. I stared at the bottom of the final page. Right there on the dotted line was my signature. It was not a clever forgery. It was my distinct, messy handwriting. I traced the black ink with my calloused thumb, my mind racing to comprehend how a massive loan I never authorized bore my exact signature. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds human judgment and leads to fatal mistakes. During my years serving in military intelligence, I was rigorously trained to suppress fear, compartmentalize trauma, and analyze the battlefield with absolute objectivity. As I stared at my own signature, the panicked, heartbroken father disappeared, and the seasoned intelligence officer woke up from a long slumber. I closed my eyes, rewinding my memory exactly 3 years back to find the exact moment of compromise. It was Thanksgiving weekend. Cameron had stopped by the house for a rare rushed visit before a luxury ski trip. He had brought a thick stack of corporate papers claiming his real estate firm was going through a massive federal audit to secure commercial development licenses. He told me he needed character reference signatures and a personnel guarantee from immediate family members to clear his executive background check. He had pointed to a specific line, keeping his hand casually covering the top half of the document, rushing me because he had a first-class flight to catch. I had trusted my son implicitly. I had signed a piece of paper that handed him the entire equity of my home without reading the fine print. My blood turned to ice, but my face remained completely impassive. I looked up at Mr. Henderson. I did not yell. I did not accuse anyone of fraud just yet. Instead, I tapped the paper with a steady finger. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice eerily calm and authoritative. When this massive loan was approved, the funds were dispersed. I want the complete routing history. I want to know exactly which bank account that $150,000 was wired into. Henderson hesitated, citing internal privacy policies, but my glare cut through his pathetic corporate excuses. I am the primary borrower on this legal document, I reminded him sharply. Print the wire transfer records immediately. He nodded nervously, his printer humming loudly as it churned out the transaction history. I took the freshly printed pages, folded them neatly, and walked out of the bank without another word. Sitting in the driver's seat of my freezing car, I stared at the folded papers resting in my lap. I did not call Cameron. I knew exactly how he operated under pressure. He would deny, deflect, and try to manipulate the narrative to make me feel crazy. Instead, I dialed a number I actively avoided. Melanie. My pristine, wealthy white daughter-in-law who always looked at me like dirt on the bottom of her designer shoes. She picked up on the fourth ring, the sound of a private Pilates instructor barking breathing exercises in the background. "Hello, Nelson," she answered, her tone dripping with that familiar saccharine condescension she reserved exclusively for me and Alicia. "Cameron mentioned you called last night with some bad news. Prostate cancer, right? It is honestly so tragic what happens to the body when people do not take proper care of themselves or afford premium health care." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Yes, Melanie, it is cancer. I need surgery, but I am short on funds. Since Cameron is so incredibly busy with his $20 million project, I was hoping my family might help me figure out my living situation while I recover from the operation." Melanie let out a soft, pitying sigh that made my stomach churn with disgust. "Oh, Nelson. Cameron and I were just talking about your situation over breakfast this morning. You are getting older. Living alone in that run-down neighborhood is not safe anymore, especially with your declining health and lack of savings. We think it is time for a permanent transition." "A transition?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, masking the rage boiling inside my chest. "Yes," she continued, her voice brightening with fake enthusiasm. "There are some wonderful state-funded charity nursing homes just outside the city limits. They take excellent care of low-income seniors. You would not have to worry about cleaning or cooking or paying those pesky utility bills. As for your house, Cameron and I are willing to step up and take on the burden of managing the property for you. We can handle the deed transfer seamlessly. That way you can just relax in a state facility and let us deal with your remaining assets. It is the best option so you do not end up struggling like Alicia. The sheer audacity of her proposal hung heavily in the dead air between us. She was not just writing me off to a poorly funded charity ward to die quietly. She was actively trying to hustle the deed to my house out from under me, completely unaware that I already knew they had bled the equity dry 3 years ago. "That is a very interesting proposal, Melanie," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I am sure you and Cameron would do a fantastic job managing my assets." "Well, we are just trying to be a supportive modern family," she purred. "We really have to run Nelson. Take care of yourself." The line clicked dead. I slowly lowered the phone, the suffocating silence of the car wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I reached for the stack of bank records Mr. Henderson had printed. I deliberately unfolded the pages and flipped to the second sheet, running my index finger down the column of numbers to the final wire transfer destination. My eyes locked onto the receiving account name printed in stark black ink. The $150,000 stolen from the walls of my home had not gone to Cameron's real estate firm to cover a bad commercial investment. It had not gone to pay off his corporate debts. The entire sum had been wired directly into the business checking account of Melanie's luxury fashion boutique, the exact same boutique she loved to boast about in high-end magazines as a brilliant self-made success story. The betrayal was absolute and complete. I placed the damning papers on the passenger seat, pulled out my car keys, and started the ignition. The heavy iron gates of Cameron's sprawling estate opened slowly, revealing perfectly manicured lawns and the blindingly bright facade of his multi-million-dollar mansion. I parked my beat-up 20-year-old sedan between a sleek Porsche and a towering luxury SUV. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, leaning heavily on my cane and deliberately letting my shoulders slump forward. I needed them to see exactly what they expected to see. A broken, sick, and desperate old man on the verge of losing his home. I rang the doorbell and a uniformed maid ushered me into the expansive dining room where crystal chandeliers cast a cold, brilliant light over a massive mahogany table. Cameron barely looked up from his smartphone when I entered. Melanie, however, greeted me with a tight plastic smile. She was already holding a glass of imported white wine. "Nelson, I am so glad you could make it," she chirped, though her eyes scanned my faded cardigan with obvious unconcealed distaste. Dinner was an agonizing affair of clinking silver cutlery and passive-aggressive interrogations. Melanie did not waste a single moment before taking aim at the only person who actually cared about me. "I just do not understand how Alicia manages her life," Melanie said, taking a delicate bite of her salmon. "Working those terrible night shifts at the public hospital. It must be so exhausting being surrounded by those kinds of lower-class people all the time. It is a real shame she never had the drive or ambition to pursue a real medical degree like my brother did. I suppose not everyone is cut out for higher education, but someone has to clean the bedpans right." I gripped my fork tightly under the table. My daughter was saving lives every single night, while this woman built a superficial fashion brand using stolen money from my very home. But I forced my expression to remain docile. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the defeated patriarch to absolute perfection. Melanie's arrogance was not a new development. It was woven tightly into the very fabric of her upbringing. Her parents were old money elites from Connecticut, the kind of wealthy, white upper-class people who inherited generational fortunes, but firmly believed their success was entirely self-made. From the exact moment Cameron introduced Melanie to our family, her parents made it abundantly clear that they viewed Alicia and me as an unfortunate blemish on Cameron's otherwise stellar corporate resume. To them, Cameron was the rare exception to his race and background, a miraculous success story who had properly escaped his blue-collar urban roots. But Alicia and I, we were the uncomfortable reminders of where he came from. We were the poor black relatives they merely had to tolerate at holiday gatherings. At their lavish wedding reception years ago, Melanie's mother actually seated me at a table near the kitchen doors, speaking to me slowly and loudly all night as if I struggled to comprehend basic English. They always assumed Alicia was constantly begging Cameron for handouts, completely blind to the agonizing reality that Cameron was the one secretly draining my life savings. Melanie treated her marriage to my son as a noble, charitable rescue mission. She genuinely believed she had elevated him, polished his rough edges, and brought him into polite society. And Cameron, utterly blinded by his desperate, pathetic need to fit into their exclusive world, allowed them to disrespect his own flesh and blood. He nodded along with their racial microaggressions, actively distancing himself from us to secure his permanent place at their mahogany tables. Sitting across from them now, watching Melanie swirl her expensive wine while subtly tearing down my daughter's honest, grueling work, the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. She sat there acting like absolute royalty, wearing designer clothes funded directly by the stolen equity of my modest, hard-earned home. I swallowed the dry, tasteless food on my plate, maintaining my fragile facade of the helpless, financially ruined senior citizen. I let her talk. I let her feel incredibly superior. Because in the unforgiving world of military intelligence gathering, you never interrupt an enemy while they are actively handing you ammunition. As the agonizing dinner finally concluded, Cameron wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and stood up abruptly. "Dad, come into my study. We need to discuss your medical situation right now." I followed him down the long, echoing corridor into a sprawling room lined with leather-bound books that he had likely never even opened. He closed the heavy oak door, completely muffling the sounds of the mansion behind us. He walked over to his massive executive desk, poured himself a generous glass of expensive scotch, and leaned back against the polished wood. "Listen, Dad." Cameron began, his tone instantly shifting into his practiced, authoritative boardroom voice. "Melanie and I have been discussing your unfortunate diagnosis. We know you need that $5,600 for the surgery deposit. And honestly, we are becoming incredibly worried about your mental and physical decline. You are getting much older. You are simply not thinking clearly anymore." He opened a heavy desk drawer and pulled out a thick, imposing stack of legal documents, slapping them down hard on the desk. "I am willing to cover your hospital deductible. I will write the check tonight. But I am not just going to hand over cash without permanently protecting my own interests." I stared down at the thick stack of papers, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. "What is this, Cameron?" I asked, keeping my voice frail, shaky, and deliberately uncertain. "It is a comprehensive medical proxy and a completely revised last will and testament," he stated flatly, without a single ounce of shame. "If I am going to pay for your health care, I need full legal authority to make your medical decisions moving forward. Furthermore, you will sign over all your remaining assets, including the deed to your house, directly to me tonight. Alicia is terrible with money. She will just squander whatever you leave behind. I am the only one capable of managing the estate properly. You sign these papers right now, assigning me as your sole beneficiary and legal guardian, and I will give you the money to save your life. It is a win-win situation." The absolute freezing coldness of his proposition hung heavily in the dead air. My own son, the boy whose diapers I had changed, the teenager I had starved myself for so he could attend an elite university, was extorting me on my deathbed. He was holding my very life hostage in exchange for complete dictatorial legal control over my existence. He wanted the legal power to pull the plug on me whenever he deemed my medical care too burdensome, and the legal right to legally strip away the very home he had already secretly pillaged. I looked deeply into the eyes of the man standing arrogantly before me. There was not a single trace of the little boy I had raised left in him. He was a hollow, greedy, pathetic shell of a human being. "No," I said, my voice suddenly losing all of its previous frailty. The word was sharp, clear, and commanding, ringing through the study like a gunshot. Cameron blinked, visibly startled by the sudden drastic shift in my physical demeanor. "Excuse me," he stammered, his grip tightening on his glass of scotch. I said, "No, Cameron. Keep your blood money." I turned my back on him and walked straight out of the study, leaving him standing there completely speechless. I marched purposefully out the front doors of the mansion and out into the freezing night air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old sedan and locked the heavy doors. I reached deep into the hidden, secure compartment of my center console and pulled out a heavy, outdated burner phone that I had not charged or looked at in over 15 years. I pressed the power button, watching the old green screen flicker brightly to life. I dialed a highly secure private number I had memorized decades ago. A crisp, incredibly professional voice answered on the very first ring. "Oliver speaking." I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes fixed furiously on the glowing windows of Cameron's massive mansion. "Oliver," I said, my voice carrying the immense weight of absolute, undeniable authority. "It is Nelson. Reactivate the Apex Trust. It is time." Less than 12 hours later, I walked through the heavily tinted glass doors of a highly secure private wealth management firm located in the most expensive high-rise building downtown. I was no longer slouching like a defeated old man. I had left the wooden cane in the trunk of my car. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, carrying the disciplined, vigilant posture of the military intelligence officer I used to be. The soft hum of the city traffic below was the only sound in the sprawling office. Oliver, a sharp, impeccably dressed attorney in his late 50s, stood up from behind a massive marble desk to greet me. He locked the heavy soundproof doors behind us and pulled down the privacy blinds. We had not spoken face to face in over a decade, but our mutual respect remained entirely unbroken. He walked over to a biometric wall safe, scanned his fingerprint, and pulled out a thick, heavily guarded black binder. He set it gently on the polished table between us. "Welcome back, Nelson," Oliver said quietly, opening the binder to the very first page. "Here is the current portfolio for Apex Holdings." I looked down at the documents, feeling a strange mix of ultimate power and profound sorrow. The paperwork confirmed what had been legally true for decades, a secret I had guarded with my very life. I, Nelson Holloway, the man who drove a beat-up sedan and clipped grocery coupons to survive, was the sole undisputed owner of Apex Holdings. It was a massive corporate trust that owned and controlled dozens of acres of the most valuable prime commercial real estate in the very center of the city. I traced my calloused fingers over the property maps, vivid memories flooding my mind. This massive empire did not come from a Wall Street boardroom. It came directly from my grandfather. He was a resilient, hard-working black man who faced unimaginable discrimination, working tirelessly through an era designed to keep men who looked like him at the absolute bottom. Despite the systemic barriers trying to crush him, he quietly saved his meager wages and bought up massive tracts of unwanted, undeveloped dirt on the extreme outskirts of the city 50 years ago. People mocked him, calling it useless swampland. But the city expanded rapidly, and over the decades, that useless dirt became the absolute most coveted diamond real estate in the entire state. When my father eventually passed the deeds down to me, I had a critical choice to make. During my time in military intelligence and later as a regular postal worker, I saw exactly what sudden unearned wealth did to families. It poisoned them. It bred entitlement, laziness, and ruthless greed. I wanted Cameron and Alicia to grow up grounded. I wanted them to understand the fundamental value of a hard day of work and build their own legacies from the ground up. So I made a radical decision. I walked into Oliver's office decades ago, signed the paperwork, and locked the entire fortune away in a blind trust. I chose to live an intentionally modest life. I let the trust grow silently in the shadows, managed entirely by Oliver's firm, completely insulated from my daily existence. I sacrificed my own luxury to protect my children from being corrupted by the power of the almighty dollar. But looking at the paperwork now, the bitter reality tasted like ash in my mouth. I had successfully protected Cameron from the corrupting influence of my generational wealth, but I had completely failed to protect him from his own innate, terrifying greed. Oliver cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present moment. He flipped the binder to a freshly printed section marked with urgent red tabs. "Nelson, you need to see exactly what your son has been doing lately," Oliver stated, his tone shifting into pure legal precision. He slid a glossy, high-resolution architectural rendering across the marble desk. I stared at the image. It was a towering structure of glass and steel designed to house luxury retail and elite corporate offices. It was the exact same $20 million commercial complex Cameron had been loudly bragging about on the phone, the crown jewel of his real estate firm. The massive project he claimed had tied up all his capital, the very reason he coldly refused to help pay for my cancer surgery. I looked up at Oliver, waiting for the connection. Oliver pointed a sharp silver pen directly at the property address printed at the bottom of the blueprint. "Cameron does not own the land this massive project is being built on," Oliver explained slowly, making sure I absorbed every single word. "He is leasing the commercial ground, and he is leasing it directly from Apex Holdings." The sheer, unbelievable poetry of the situation washed over me like a tidal wave. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Cameron, the arrogant CEO who mocked my poverty, the man who tried to extort my modest residential home in exchange for my medical care, was building his entire corporate empire on dirt owned by the very father he despised. He had absolutely no idea that the faceless multi-million-dollar corporate entity he was sending his corporate checks to was actually me. The irony was almost suffocating. He had stolen $150,000 from my house to fund his wife's vanity fashion boutique, completely oblivious to the fact that I legally owned the ground his corporate headquarters stood upon. Oliver explained how Cameron's development firm had aggressively lobbied and secured a massive ironclad commercial lease agreement with Apex Holdings 3 years ago, completely unaware of who sat at the absolute top of the corporate ladder. Oliver detailed the incredibly strict covenants of the commercial lease. Apex Holdings held the ultimate authority over the land development. Cameron was nothing more than a tenant playing king on a rented throne. I leaned back in my leather chair, processing the immense power I currently held in my hands. I did not need to fight Cameron for the deed to my small house. I did not need to beg him for respect. I already held the keys to his entire professional existence. The mighty CEO was entirely at my mercy, and he did not even know the game had officially started. But the shocking revelations did not end there. Oliver turned to the final highly classified page of the financial ledger, his expression growing exceptionally grim. "Nelson Oliver," said, his voice dropping to a serious low timbre, "Cameron is not just building on your land. He is severely defaulting on his binding lease agreement." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the highlighted red numbers sprawling across the financial spreadsheet. According to the highly confidential banking records, Cameron's real estate firm had missed 4 consecutive monthly lease payments to Apex Holdings. The great untouchable CEO, the man who was popping expensive champagne and celebrating his massive success with elite investors, was secretly drowning in massive corporate debt. He was highly leveraged, completely out of liquid capital, and standing on the absolute brink of total financial ruin. He was desperately trying to keep up appearances, faking his extreme wealth to his high society in-laws while his actual business accounts bled dry. The magnificent $20 million project was nothing more than a fragile house of cards, and I was the one holding the massive industrial fan. The very next morning, a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled up to the cracked curb of my modest home. A young man stepped out wearing a sharp-tailored suit that screamed aggressive corporate ambition. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and wore a predatory, calculated smile. When I opened the front door, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, he introduced himself as Mr. Vance, an independent property appraiser sent by my son's real estate development firm. He spoke to me with the kind of slow, exaggerated enunciation people use when addressing a toddler or a completely senile patient. Cameron had sent him to evaluate my property under the guise of helping me transition to a charity nursing facility. I knew exactly what this was. It was a hostile takeover wrapped in a cheap suit. I shuffled slowly, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I let my hands tremble as I guided him into the living room, offering to make him a cup of hot tea. Mr. Vance barely glanced at me, his eyes already darting around my living room, mentally cataloging every single crack in the drywall and every scuff on the hardwood floor. He pulled out a laser measuring tool, treating my home like a foreclosed carcass ready to be picked clean. I hobbled into the kitchen, my back hunched, the fragile old man routine executed with absolute military precision. I clattered the porcelain teacups loudly against the counter, making sure he could hear my supposed physical struggle while keeping a sharp, watchful eye on his reflection in the hallway mirror. As the kettle began to whistle, my mind rapidly connected the remaining dots of Cameron's desperate financial strategy. Oliver's classified report from the previous day had made the situation crystal clear. Cameron was completely out of liquid capital. His massive $20 million commercial project was stalling, and he owed Apex Holdings 4 months of back rent. To save his sinking corporate ship and maintain his flawless facade of wealth in front of Melanie's elite parents, Cameron needed immediate cash. He needed to acquire an asset free and clear, something he could immediately liquidate or leverage to cover his bleeding margins. My house was his absolute perfect target. By sending a corrupt appraiser to deliberately lowball the market value of my home, Cameron planned to use his firm to buy the property for pennies on the dollar through the bank foreclosure process. Once he owned the deed, he would flip the house at its true, much higher market value, pocketing the massive difference to plug the gaping holes in his own corporate accounts. It was a ruthless, cold-blooded maneuver. He was actively orchestrating the theft of my most valuable asset, willing to throw me into a state-funded ward just to keep his own fraudulent empire afloat for a few more weeks. He had manipulated the original home equity loan to fund Melanie's boutique, and now he was returning to the scene of the crime to strip the very copper wire from the walls. I poured the boiling water into the cups, my hands perfectly steady now that I was out of his direct line of sight. The sheer mechanics of his betrayal were almost impressive in their total lack of morality. But Cameron had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed his target was a helpless, uneducated old man. He forgot that the man who raised him had spent years in military intelligence, trained to dismantle enemy operations from the inside out. I shuffled back into the living room, holding the tray of tea with a manufactured, violent tremor. The teacups rattled noisily against the saucers. "Mr." Vance was standing by the large bay window, furiously typing on his smartphone. Just as I set the heavy silver tray down on the coffee table, his phone rang loudly. He glanced at the caller identification, his arrogant expression instantly morphing into sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked at me, muttered a quick dismissive apology about an urgent client, and practically sprinted out the front door to take the call on the porch. In his frantic rush, he left his heavy leather briefcase sitting wide open on my table. I did not waste a single millisecond. The frail old man vanished instantly. I moved with swift, silent precision, reaching directly into his open briefcase. I pulled out his thick clipboard and scanned the top appraisal document. My eyes locked onto the bolded numbers at the bottom of the page. Vance was preparing to officially value my home at exactly 40% below the current market rate, citing entirely fabricated structural damages and non-existent foundational rot. But it was the second document underneath the appraisal form that caught my immediate attention. It was a printed email correspondence between Vance and Cameron. As I rapidly memorized the text, Vance's frantic voice drifted through the partially open front window. He was speaking in a hushed, terrified tone, completely unaware that sound carries perfectly across an old wooden porch. "Listen to me," Vance hissed into his phone. "You need to tell Cameron to stall them. The old man is a complete pushover. The house is basically ours, but the legal paperwork takes time. You cannot let those loan sharks near the corporate office. If those underground lenders call his debt early, they will break his legs before they seize the company accounts." I froze, standing perfectly still in the center of my living room. Underground lenders, loan sharks. The final terrifying pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together. Cameron was not just dodging traditional bank loans. Mainstream financial institutions had already cut him off entirely because of his terrible credit and heavily leveraged assets. In his sheer desperation to fund his vanity project and keep up appearances, my son had borrowed millions from predatory black market lenders at exorbitant, crippling interest rates. He was swimming in incredibly dangerous waters with ruthless men who did not negotiate in corporate boardrooms but with brutal physical violence. Cameron was not just facing bankruptcy, he was facing total physical ruin. I carefully slipped the documents back into the exact position I found them, stepped away from the briefcase, and resumed my hunched posture just as the front door swung open. Vance rushed back inside, sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He was completely unaware that his entire illicit operation had just been fundamentally compromised. He quickly packed up his briefcase, threw a fake strained smile my way, and promised to send the final property evaluation soon. As soon as his sleek car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and dropped the act entirely. The revelation of Cameron's dangerous black market debt changed the entire landscape of my retaliation. Knowing he was backed into a lethal corner, any normal father might have immediately intervened to save his child from physical harm. But Cameron was no longer my son. He was a hostile threat who needed to be neutralized permanently. I pulled out my secure burner phone and dialed Oliver's direct line. "Oliver," I said, my voice commanding and absolute, "I need you to contact Cameron's real estate firm today. Grant his company a full 30-day extension on his overdue lease payments for the Apex land. Tell his financial department that corporate is willing to work with him." Oliver paused on the other end of the line, clearly surprised by the sudden leniency. "Are you certain, Nelson? You have every legal right to evict him today." "Absolutely," I replied, staring at my cold reflection in the hallway mirror. "Let him climb to the very top. Let him think he has won and secured his funding. I want him as high up as possible before I pull the ladder away." 3 days later, the blinding, sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital operating room faded into a hazy, disorienting darkness. I had successfully undergone the invasive prostate cancer surgery. The exorbitant hospital fees, the massive deductibles, and the premium VIP recovery suite had all been paid in full, seamlessly and anonymously, through a routed account managed directly by Apex Holdings. When Alicia had cried in absolute relief in the waiting room, asking how the hospital suddenly cleared me for the procedure without the upfront cash, I lied to her with a completely straight face. I told her a local charitable foundation for elderly veterans had stepped in at the last minute to grant me a full medical financial waiver. I could not bear to reveal my hand just yet, not when she was already carrying the weight of the entire world on her fragile shoulders. As the heavy surgical anesthesia slowly began to wear off, I drifted back into consciousness. My body felt as though it had been repeatedly struck by a massive freight train. A searing, agonizing pain tore through my lower abdomen, radiating outward like hot, jagged knives twisting deeply into my flesh. I let out a low, involuntary groan, my throat feeling as dry and rough as sandpaper. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed was the only sound anchoring me to reality. I slowly blinked my eyes open, the blurry, stark white shapes of the recovery room gradually coming into sharp focus. But the intense, tearing physical pain in my stomach was instantly dwarfed by a profound, suffocating emotional ache the very moment I turned my head. Sitting rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic hospital chair pulled right up to the edge of my mattress was Alicia. She was slumped forward, her head resting gently on the edge of my bed sheets, completely fast asleep. She was still wearing her faded, wrinkled nursing scrubs from her own grueling night shift. Deep, dark purple circles hung heavily under her closed eyes, a stark testament to her absolute physical and mental exhaustion. I looked down at her scuffed, worn-out sneakers, a brutal contrast to the imported designer heels Melanie had paraded around in during that vile dinner. Alicia's rough, tired hands were wrapped tightly around my left arm, holding on to me as if letting go would mean losing me forever. Looking down at my daughter, a massive wave of guilt crashed over me, heavier than any physical trauma I had ever endured in my life. This was the child I had routinely ignored. This was the daughter I had continuously passed over, saving every spare cent to fund Cameron's lavish Ivy League lifestyle and corporate dreams. She had sold her only car, ready to sacrifice her own children's education and plunge herself into crippling debt just to make sure her father survived the week. She had taken 2 different city buses in the freezing rain just to get to the hospital and had not left my bedside for a single second during the agonizingly long surgical procedure. Meanwhile, the brother she had always been compared to the multi-millionaire real estate CEO, who was currently celebrating his freshly granted 30-day corporate lease extension, was entirely absent. I stared at Alicia's exhausted face and made a silent, unbreakable promise to the universe. I would protect her fiercely. I would make sure she never had to work another soul-crushing graveyard shift, and I would ensure she inherited the absolute entirety of the Apex Holdings empire. She was the true legacy of the Holloway family. As I gently shifted my weight, gritting my teeth against the sharp abdominal pain to avoid waking her, my eyes caught sight of a small metal rolling table positioned on the opposite side of my hospital bed. For a brief, foolish second, a tiny sliver of paternal hope flickered in my chest. I thought perhaps Cameron had finally found a shred of basic human decency. I thought perhaps the harsh reality of his father going under the knife for a life-threatening cancer had shaken some sense into his greedy, arrogant skull. Instead, sitting next to a plastic water pitcher was a pathetic, generic fruit basket wrapped in cheap, crinkling cellophane. The fruit inside looked bruised, dull, and entirely unappetizing, likely purchased from a discount convenience store at the absolute last minute. Tucked carelessly into the cheap plastic ribbon at the top was not a handwritten card from my son. It was a pristine, embossed business card belonging to Cameron's executive assistant. A sterile, formally typed note was stapled directly to the card, wishing me a speedy recovery on behalf of the corporate management team. The absolute coldness of the gesture felt like a physical slap to the face. Cameron did not even bother to show up. He did not call the hospital to check on my surgical status. He did not send a personal message or a text to his own sister to see if I had survived the operation. He had literally delegated his own father's cancer surgery to an underpaid secretary. The wealthy CEO, who was perfectly capable of dropping thousands of dollars on imported champagne and luxury dinners to impress his racist high society in-laws, could not spare 10 minutes to visit the man who had starved himself to put clothes on his back. He was probably sitting in his corner office right now, arrogantly thinking he had outsmarted the underground loan sharks with his new lease extension, completely unbothered by whether I lived or died. I stared at the pathetic bruised fruit basket, my heart turning entirely to stone. Every lingering ounce of fatherly affection I had unknowingly held on to evaporated into the cold, sanitized hospital air. He had shown me exactly who he was, and I was finally ready to believe him completely. The heavy wooden door of my hospital room creaked open, breaking the silence. An older night nurse walked in quietly to check my intravenous fluid bags and adjust the monitors. She noticed Alicia sleeping and leaned down, whispering softly so as not to wake her, entirely unaware that I was completely conscious and listening to every single word. "Miss Holloway," the nurse whispered, leaning close to Alicia's ear, "I need to let you know that a man claiming to be your brother came by earlier today, while your father was still heavily sedated under the surgical anesthesia. He completely bypassed the visitor waiting room and sneaked right into the intensive recovery ward. He became incredibly aggressive with the medical staff when we told him to leave. He actually tried to force me to let him press your unconscious father's thumbprint onto a dense stack of legal property transfer documents and a durable power of attorney. I had to call hospital security to physically threaten him with police involvement before he finally fled the premises." The nurse patted Alicia's shoulder gently and quietly exited the room. I kept my eyes shut tight, my breathing perfectly steady despite the inferno of rage igniting in my chest. My own son had sneaked into a hospital ward like a common thief. He had tried to steal my home and strip my legal rights away while I was lying unconscious and bleeding on an operating table. The desperation from his black market debts was driving him to commit outright physical assault and fraud against his own flesh and blood. I squeezed my eyes shut permanently, severing the very last emotional tie to the man who shared my name. The forgiving father was officially dead. Only the executioner remained. I barely had time to recover from the severe physical trauma of the cancer surgery. The surgical incisions burned with a dull, constant ache every time I moved, but I pushed through the pain to return to the quiet solitude of my small house. Just 2 days after my discharge from the hospital, while I was sitting at my kitchen table trying to drink a cup of black coffee and regain my basic strength, a heavy, aggressive knock echoed through the front door. A cold, indifferent process server stood on my porch, handing me a thick manila envelope before turning and walking away without a single word. I sat back down at the table and opened it, reading the bold, intimidating legal print. It was an official court summons. Cameron, my own flesh and blood, had formally filed a petition for emergency legal guardianship over me. He was officially requesting the state court to strip me of my civil rights, my financial autonomy, and my fundamental ability to make my own medical decisions. The legal documents were filled with blatant, fabricated lies. They claimed that my recent prostate cancer surgery, combined with the heavy neurological effects of the surgical anesthesia and my advancing age, had triggered severe cognitive decline and early-stage dementia. He painted a pathetic manufactured picture of a frail, confused old man who was a danger to himself and completely incapable of managing his own assets. Cameron wanted a judge to grant him absolute dictatorial control over my life, my bank accounts, and my property. It was the ultimate betrayal executed with cold, calculating legal precision. He had failed to steal my signature while I was lying unconscious in the recovery ward, so now he was using the judicial system to legally kidnap my entire existence. Within an hour of my call, Oliver was sitting across from me at my kitchen table. His usually composed, sharply professional demeanor was completely replaced by visible outrage. He slammed his leather briefcase down on the wood, his face flushed with righteous anger. "This is a classic predatory legal scam," Nelson Oliver explained, his voice sharp and dripping with absolute disgust. "It happens all the time across the country. Greedy relatives or corrupt state conservators use exaggerated medical claims to declare an elderly person legally incompetent. Once the judge grants the guardianship petition, the victim becomes a total ghost in the eyes of the law. They lose the right to vote, the right to marry, the right to hire their own lawyer, and most importantly, the absolute right to control their own money. The appointed guardian gets a blank check to drain the entire estate under the guise of paying for their care. They bill exorbitant management fees, sell off family homes, and liquidate assets until the victim is left with absolutely nothing but a bed in a poorly funded state charity ward." Oliver paced the small kitchen, running a hand through his gray hair in deep frustration. "Cameron is leveraging your recent surgery and the natural physical fatigue from the anesthesia to build a fabricated, malicious case against you. He wants to legally steal your house to pay off his dangerous black market lenders, and he is using the court system to do his dirty work. I am filing an immediate counter-petition today," Oliver declared firmly. "We will bring in our own top-tier medical experts. We will subpoena the hospital nursing staff who saw him try to physically assault you in the recovery room. We will crush this fraudulent claim before it even reaches a preliminary hearing. I will personally ensure the judge throws this out and sanctions him for filing a malicious petition. We end this right now." I looked down at the court summons resting on the table, tracing the sharp black letters of Cameron's name with my calloused index finger. A cold, absolute calm washed over me, chilling my blood and sharpening my mind into a lethal, focused weapon. The seasoned military intelligence officer inside me woke up entirely viewing the situation not as a familial tragedy, but as a tactical battlefield with pristine clarity. I slowly looked up at Oliver, a dark, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. "No, Oliver," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an ironclad, unyielding authority that made the seasoned lawyer freeze in his tracks. "We are not going to file a counter-petition. We are not going to stop this process." Oliver stared at me, completely bewildered. "Nelson, you cannot be serious. If you do not fight this aggressively right now, you risk a corrupt judge actually granting him control. You are playing an incredibly dangerous game with your entire autonomy." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table, my eyes locking onto his. "I am perfectly aware of the massive risks," I replied smoothly. "But if we squash this petition today, Cameron will just scurry back into the shadows and look for another deceitful way to strike. He is desperate. The underground loan sharks are breathing down his neck. He needs my assets immediately to cover his failing $20 million project and his massive lease defaults with Apex Holdings. I want him to believe he has the upper hand. I want him to feel absolute, intoxicating victory." I paused, letting the heavy silence emphasize my words. "The court documents say he is sending a state-appointed psychiatrist to my house this Friday to conduct a comprehensive mental evaluation. Let the doctor come. I will welcome him into my home with open arms. I want Cameron to spend his dwindling financial resources on this farce. I want him to expose his entire strategy. I will play the frail, confused old man for his doctor. I have survived grueling interrogations in hostile foreign territories, Oliver. A bribed psychiatrist conducting a standard cognitive test is absolute child's play. We will let him build his fragile house of cards, and then we will set it on fire while he is standing happily inside." Oliver slowly sat back down, a look of profound respect replacing his earlier panic. He nodded once, finally understanding the full, devastating scope of my strategy. Just as Oliver packed his briefcase to leave, my secondary burner phone rang loudly. It was Alicia. I answered it, but instead of her usual warm greeting, I heard a chaotic, violent shouting match echoing through the speaker. She had discovered the copy of the court summons I left on the kitchen counter earlier and marched straight into Cameron's sleek downtown corporate office to confront him. "You are trying to declare our father insane to steal his house," Alicia screamed, her voice shaking with furious, betrayed tears. Cameron's voice boomed back, arrogant and vicious. "Keep your voice down. He is a senile old fool, and I am stepping up to manage his pathetic life." I heard the sound of a violent physical scuffle, followed by a sickening, sharp smack. Alicia cried out in pain, the heavy sound of her body hitting the hardwood floor, vibrating through the phone speaker. "You listen to me!" Cameron roared, his voice devoid of any human soul. "You and that old man are nothing but worthless leeches holding me back." I sat in my kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the table as the line went dead. The horrific sound of my daughter hitting the hardwood floor replayed in my mind like a broken record for 2 straight days. Every single fiber of my being wanted to drive down to Cameron's corporate headquarters, kick his mahogany doors off their hinges, and break his jaw for putting his hands on his sister. But a master strategist never abandons the long game for a momentary release of blind anger. I had to remain entirely focused on the ultimate objective. By Friday morning, I was sitting in my modest living room, perfectly calm, waiting for the state-appointed psychiatrist to arrive. At precisely 9 o'clock, a pristine black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. A man in a sharp, tailored suit stepped out carrying a thick leather briefcase. This was Dr. Arthur Vance. According to the official court documents Cameron filed, he was a highly respected psychiatric evaluator tasked with determining my mental competency. But according to the highly classified dossier Oliver had handed me the night before, he was a corrupt, morally bankrupt hired gun sitting comfortably on my son's secret payroll. I opened the front door before he could even knock. Dr. Vance offered a tight, patronizing smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Good morning, Nelson," he said, stepping into my home without wiping his expensive shoes. He spoke painfully slow and unnaturally loud, pitching his voice as if I were already deaf and deeply senile. "I am here to have a little chat with you today. Just a friendly conversation to see how you are feeling after your big surgery. I stepped aside, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, allowing him to enter. He walked straight to my dining table, pulling out a chair without asking for permission. He unlatched his briefcase and clicked his gold pen, looking around my simple living room with a thinly veiled sneer of superiority. His entire demeanor screamed absolute arrogance. He had clearly walked into this house assuming I was an uneducated, vulnerable senior citizen, ready to be easily railroaded into a locked psychiatric ward so his wealthy client could liquidate my assets. Dr. Vance started the evaluation with the standard insulting baseline cognitive tests designed to establish a baseline of mental deterioration. "Nelson, can you tell me what city we are in right now?" he asked, writing something down on his legal pad before I even answered the question. "Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? Can you remember these 3 simple words for me? Apple, table, penny." I answered every single question flawlessly, my voice remaining completely monotone and cooperative. But beneath my docile exterior, the former military intelligence officer was actively scanning the enemy sitting across the table. During my years interrogating hostile assets overseas, I learned a crucial lesson about human nature. People are incredibly fragile creatures when they falsely believe they hold all the power in the room. They get sloppy. They leak critical information through their body language. I noticed the faint, uncontrollable tremor in Dr. Vance's left hand every time his phone buzzed in his pocket. I saw the dark, heavy bags under his eyes, poorly concealed by an expensive cosmetic concealer. I observed the way he obsessively checked the diamond-encrusted watch on his wrist, a timepiece that cost significantly more than a standard state-appointed medical official should reasonably be able to afford. He was a man drowning in his own hidden pressures, rushing through the medical evaluation to secure his illicit paycheck. As he continued to ask patronizing questions about my daily routine and my ability to handle my own bank accounts, I decided the warm-up phase of this psychological warfare was officially over. I slowly lowered my wooden cane to the floor. I straightened my spine, shedding the hunched, frail posture I had maintained all morning. I folded my hands neatly on the table and locked my eyes directly onto his. My gaze was piercing completely, stripping away the helpless victim persona in a fraction of a second. The sudden, drastic shift in my physical presence made Dr. Vance falter mid-sentence. He blinked rapidly, visibly unnerved by the lethal, commanding energy now radiating across my dining room. "Tell me, Dr. Vance." I interrupted smoothly, my voice dropping into a cold, authoritative baritone that commanded absolute respect. "When you calculate the sum of 100 counting backward by sevens, does it help you calculate the exact amount of illicit cash Cameron Holloway wired into your offshore shell account last Tuesday?" The heavy gold pen slipped from Dr. Vance's fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden table. The condescending smirk completely vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. "Excuse me," he stammered, his professional composure shattering into a million pieces. "What did you just say to me?" I leaned forward, never breaking eye contact for a single millisecond. "I said I know exactly who you are, Arthur. I know that my son Cameron wired $25,000 to a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under your wife's maiden name. I also know exactly why he did it. You have a crippling sports gambling addiction. You owe a massive, dangerous debt to the Bellagio Sportsbook, and you are currently under a severe, quiet investigation by the State Medical Board for falsifying patient competency reports in 2 other high-profile conservatorship cases." I watched the cold sweat break out across his forehead. He opened his mouth to deny the accusations, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was suffocating on his own exposed secrets. I did not give him a single second to recover his breath. I continued my relentless verbal assault, dismantling his life piece by piece. My attorney Oliver has compiled a comprehensive, airtight legal dossier containing your bank statements, your illegal wire transfers, and your long history of fraudulent medical evaluations. I have completely aced your little cognitive test today. So here is exactly what is going to happen next. You are going to pack up your expensive leather briefcase. You are going to walk out of my house. You are going to call Cameron and tell him that Nelson Holloway is in pristine mental condition and that you are officially withdrawing yourself from this legal petition immediately. If you attempt to file a single page of fabricated medical evidence claiming I am incompetent, My legal team will hand your entire dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Medical Licensing Board by noon tomorrow. You will not just lose your lucrative medical license, Arthur. You will spend the next decade rotting in a federal penitentiary for fraud and elder abuse. Do we have a clear mutual understanding? Dr. Vance was trembling visibly now. He looked at me not as a patient, but as an apex predator who had just backed him into a lethal, inescapable corner. He scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently he could barely latch his briefcase closed. Yes, he choked out, gasping for air as if the room had suddenly lost all its oxygen. You are perfectly sane, Mr. Holloway. I am dropping the case right now. I will not contact your son again. I swear to you. He practically ran toward the front door, bumping his shoulder heavily against the hallway wall in his blind panic to escape my house. As he frantically yanked his briefcase off the entryway table, the brass latch caught sharply on the fabric of his heavy winter coat. The briefcase jolted open for a fraction of a second, and a small, crumpled piece of yellow paper fluttered out, landing silently on the welcome mat. He did not even notice the dropped item. He ripped the front door open, sprinted to his luxury sedan, and peeled out of my driveway as if his life depended on it. I walked calmly to the door and picked up the discarded yellow sticky note. I unfolded it instantly, recognizing Cameron's rushed, frantic handwriting. It was a terrifying timeline of his impending financial ruin. The note detailed a final, non-negotiable deadline to pay $5 million in cash to his violent underground lenders. I stared at the specific dates circled heavily in thick red ink. The deadline matched perfectly. It was the exact same night Cameron was scheduled to host his massive, highly publicized high society gala to officially launch his $20 million commercial real estate project. The sticky note left behind by the corrupt psychiatrist was the ultimate tactical advantage. It gave me the exact timeline of my son's impending financial execution. The deadline to pay the violent underground syndicate aligned perfectly with the upcoming launch of his massive real estate project. But before that grand gala could even take place, Cameron had to celebrate a personal milestone. It was the night of his 40th birthday. He had rented out the entire main dining room of a highly exclusive Michelin star restaurant in the city's wealthiest district to host a private, luxurious dinner for his top-tier venture capitalist investors. He was using his own birthday as a desperate high-stakes networking event to secure the final round of funding he needed to survive. I did not receive an invitation, of course, but a man who holds the deed to the ground beneath their feet does not need an invitation to walk into a room. I arrived at the restaurant just as the valet attendants were parking a line of sleek European sports cars. I stepped out of a standard city cab wearing the absolute best suit I owned. It was a classic navy blue two-piece I had purchased over 2 decades ago. It was impeccably clean and freshly pressed, but the lapels were undeniably out of style, and the cuffs bore the faint, unmistakable fraying of time and hard labor. I walked through the towering glass doors, instantly engulfed by the scent of expensive truffles, roasted garlic, and old money. The dining room was a stunning display of crystal chandeliers, dark velvet draping, and soft string quartet music playing in the background. My sudden presence in the grand foyer was like a dark, jagged scratch across a priceless painting. I ignored the panicked look of the host at the reservation desk and walked straight into the main dining area, my eyes locked on the massive, lavishly decorated VIP table situated right in the very center of the room. Cameron was holding court dressed in a custom tuxedo, laughing loudly with a group of older, wealthy investors. Before I could even take 10 steps into the room, a frantic, aggressive blur of emerald silk intercepted me. It was Melanie. She had spotted me from across the room, her eyes widening in absolute horror, as if a wild animal had just wandered into her pristine living room. She abandoned her conversation and practically sprinted over to me, grabbing my arm with a grip tight enough to leave bruises. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper, as she forcefully steered me away from the center of the room and out of the direct line of sight of the wealthy guests. "You were not invited, Nelson. This is a highly exclusive corporate dinner for Cameron's major investors. You are going to ruin everything looking like a homeless person." I did not pull my arm away. I simply let her drag me, maintaining a perfectly calm, blank expression. "I wanted to wish my son a happy birthday," I replied mildly. Melanie let out a sharp, breathless scoff, glancing frantically over her shoulder to make sure none of her elite socialite friends were watching her interact with me. She knew she could not risk causing a loud public scene by calling security to drag her own father-in-law out the front door. That kind of trashy scandal would spread through her country club gossip circles by morning. Instead, her eyes darted to the absolute darkest, least desirable corner of the entire restaurant. It was a tiny, cramped two-top table shoved tightly against the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen, right where the busboys aggressively scraped dirty plates and waiters rushed by with heavy trays. "Sit there," she commanded, shoving me toward the dark corner. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not embarrass us. I will have a waiter bring you some food, and then you will leave quietly before the cake is cut. Do you understand me?" She turned on her expensive heels and hurried back to the bright lights of the VIP table, plastering her fake, radiant smile back onto her face as if nothing had happened. She thought she had successfully humiliated me. She thought relegating me to the shadows beside the noisy kitchen doors was a brutal punishment designed to put me in my place. She was a deeply foolish woman. During my years in military intelligence, the very first rule of conducting a successful surveillance operation was securing a vantage point that rendered the operative completely invisible while providing an unobstructed line of sight to the primary target. Melanie had not punished me. She had just handed me the absolute best tactical seat in the entire building. A waiter soon arrived looking deeply uncomfortable and quickly set a beautifully plated dry-aged steak in front of me. I picked up my silver fork and knife and began to eat with slow, methodical precision. The steak was phenomenal, easily the best meal I had eaten in years, and I savored every single bite of it. As the noisy clatter of the kitchen doors provided the perfect acoustic cover, I reached into the breast pocket of my faded navy suit jacket. I pulled out a sleek, highly advanced directional audio recorder. It was a piece of military-grade hardware Oliver had procured for me, capable of isolating and amplifying human voices from across a crowded, noisy room. I set the small metallic device right next to my water glass, adjusting the highly sensitive microphone directly toward the center of the VIP table where Cameron was sitting. I pressed the record button. Through the digital earpiece hidden discreetly in my left ear, the ambient noise of the restaurant completely vanished, replaced by the crystal-clear, booming voice of my son. He was flushed several glasses deep into a bottle of vintage wine and speaking with a reckless, intoxicating arrogance to the three venture capitalists sitting across from him. "Gentlemen, I assure you the timeline for the commercial complex is absolutely rock solid," Cameron boasted, leaning back in his chair with a smug, deeply flawed confidence. "The foundation is poured, the steel is ordered, and the ground lease is completely secure." One of the older investors, a man with silver hair and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. "We heard rumors about the Apex Trust, Cameron. We heard they are notoriously difficult landowners and that your lease was under strict review. We cannot risk a $20 million capital injection if the ground beneath the project is unstable." Cameron let out a loud, highly theatrical laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "Apex Trust is an absolute joke, Richard. It is a dinosaur of a holding company managed by ancient lawyers who have zero aggressive business sense. Listen to me closely. I am not just going to lease that land. I am about to buy the Apex Trust land outright." The investors raised their eyebrows, clearly intrigued by this bold, massive claim. Cameron leaned over the table, lowering his voice conspiratorially, though my directional microphone picked up every single syllable. "They are just a puppet company," he lied effortlessly. "They are currently bleeding cash and teetering on the verge of total bankruptcy. I have them completely backed into a corner. By the time our grand gala launches next week, I will have forced them into a distress sale for pennies on the dollar. You are not just funding a building, gentlemen. You are funding the absolute hostile takeover of the most valuable dirt in this city." I sat alone in my dark, hidden corner, quietly cutting another piece of my steak. I chewed slowly, savoring the incredible flavor of the meat and the absolute staggering delusion of my son. He was actively committing severe corporate fraud, blatantly lying to major institutional investors to secure funding to pay off violent loan sharks, all while boasting about destroying a company that I entirely owned. He was digging his own grave with a solid gold shovel, and I was capturing the entire process in high-definition digital audio. The level of sheer hubris required to sit in a public restaurant and falsely declare the impending bankruptcy of a billion-dollar trust fund was staggering. I let the recorder run until the venture capitalists nodded, seemingly satisfied with his aggressive, fabricated assurances, and raised their expensive crystal glasses to toast to his continued success. I took the final bite of my meal, wiped my mouth neatly with the linen napkin, and clicked the recorder off. I slipped the device safely back into my breast pocket and slowly stood up from the small table. I did not call for the check. Melanie had made it perfectly clear that I was an unwanted charity case tonight, so I let Cameron foot the bill for my Michelin star steak. I buttoned my suit jacket, gripped my wooden cane, and began my slow, steady walk toward the exit. I did not hug the shadows this time. I walked directly through the center of the brightly lit dining room, cutting a straight, uncompromising path right past the massive VIP table. As I stepped directly behind Cameron's chair, he was in the middle of raising his fresh glass of red wine, smiling broadly at an investor across the table. I stopped. I reached out and placed my heavy, calloused hand firmly onto his tailored shoulder. Cameron froze instantly, his entire body going completely rigid beneath my grip. The wealthy men at the table looked up at me in mild confusion, but I did not acknowledge them. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from my son's ear. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I spoke in a whisper so cold, so sharp, and so utterly devoid of any paternal affection that it cut straight down to his very bones. "Happy birthday," I whispered softly. "Enjoy your last days as a boss son." I removed my hand and continued my slow, steady walk toward the front doors without ever looking back. Behind me, a violent shudder ran down Cameron's spine. His fingers went completely limp, and the heavy crystal wine glass slipped right out of his hand. It shattered violently against the pristine marble floor with a loud, ringing crash, sending a pool of dark red wine bleeding across the immaculate white tablecloth. The sudden, chaotic sound of breaking glass and panicked gasps echoed through the dining room, but I simply pushed the heavy front doors open and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air. The very next morning, the crisp, unforgiving light of 8 o'clock illuminated the sleek, glass-walled lobby of Cameron's corporate headquarters. He marched through the double doors, his eyes bloodshot and his demeanor visibly rattled from our brief, chilling encounter at the restaurant the night before. But the lingering hangover and bruised ego were about to become the absolute least of his problems. His executive assistant, the same woman who had callously delivered the bruised fruit basket to my hospital recovery room, was standing rigidly in front of his mahogany desk. She was clutching a thick certified legal parcel with a trembling hand, her face completely drained of color. A process server had personally delivered it 10 minutes before he arrived. Cameron snatched the envelope from her, aggressively tearing the cardboard flap open. He pulled out the heavy, watermarked document. It was an official, legally binding notice of default from the primary legal counsel of Apex Holdings. The bold black text on the very first page did not offer another extension or a friendly corporate negotiation. It was an immediate, ruthless demand for the total sum of $2 million in accumulated back rent, late penalties, and breach of contract fines. And the most terrifying part was printed at the very bottom in capitalized red letters. The entire balance was required to be paid in full via certified wire transfer within exactly 24 hours. The 30-day grace period I had previously ordered Oliver to grant him was nothing but a tactical illusion, a long leash designed to let him run as fast as he could before I violently yanked him backward. Cameron stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the astronomical numbers. The absolute financial execution he had been trying to outrun had finally caught up to him. The severe reality of the notice of default was an outright death sentence for his entire corporate existence. The legal parameters of his commercial lease with Apex Holdings were exceptionally rigid. If Cameron failed to wire the $2 million within the 24-hour window, Apex Holdings held the unilateral legal right to instantly terminate the lease, seize the physical property, and legally confiscate every single structure, foundation, and steel beam currently built upon that dirt. The massive $20 million commercial project he had been loudly boasting about to the venture capitalists just hours earlier would completely evaporate into thin air. He would be left with absolutely nothing. Worse than that, his entire fraudulent scheme to secure investor capital relied heavily on the absolute lie that he was on the verge of buying the land outright. If the investors discovered that the land was actively being repossessed due to profound financial delinquency, they would not just pull their funding. They would immediately file federal charges for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The sheer terrifying magnitude of the collapse threatened to expose every single lie he had told over the last 3 years. The illegal home equity loan he had manipulated out of my house, the vast sums of cash he had funneled into Melanie's failing boutique, and most dangerously, the $5 million he owed to ruthless, violent underground loan sharks. His entire luxurious lifestyle, the custom suits, the imported cars, the sprawling mansion in the gated community, was built on a fragile foundation of deceit. And without the Apex land, that foundation was completely gone. He was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, looking down into a bottomless abyss of federal prison time and potential physical retaliation from men who did not care about his CEO title. The clock was ticking, and he had exactly 24 hours to produce $2 million that simply did not exist anywhere in his accounts. Panic, raw and unadulterated, set in. Cameron slammed his office door shut, locking the deadbolt with a trembling hand. He aggressively ripped off his expensive silk tie and threw it across the room. He scrambled behind his desk, his breathing heavy and erratic, and grabbed his desk phone. He immediately dialed his primary corporate lender, a major national bank that had previously extended him millions in credit. He demanded an emergency bridge loan, speaking with a desperate, frantic urgency that completely shattered his usual polished boardroom demeanor. But the senior loan officer on the other end of the line did not offer him a lifeline. The response was a flat, unapologetic rejection. The officer coldly informed Cameron that his corporate accounts had been entirely frozen pending an internal risk management review. Cameron slammed the receiver down and pulled out his cell phone, his fingers shaking wildly as he dialed a secondary private wealth bank. Again, he was met with a swift, brutal rejection. He dialed a third, a fourth, and a fifth lending institution. Every single one of them gave him the exact same terrifying answer. He was completely locked out of the mainstream financial system. What Cameron did not know was that while he was sleeping off his wine the night before, Oliver had executed the most lethal phase of my financial strike. Oliver had anonymously submitted the massive, highly classified dossier detailing Cameron's illicit black market debts and predatory underground loans directly to the automated risk assessment algorithms shared by all major national banks. The moment those underground financial ties hit his corporate tax identification number, the banking software instantly flagged him as a catastrophic liability. To the legitimate financial world, Cameron Holloway was now completely radioactive. No bank would lend him a single dime. Cameron hurled his cell phone across the spacious office, watching it shatter violently against the pristine glass wall. He grabbed the edges of his heavy mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as a guttural scream of absolute frustration ripped from his throat. He swept his arm across the surface, sending expensive monitors, framed magazine covers, and crystal awards crashing onto the hardwood floor. His perfect, curated world was disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He was completely cornered, entirely out of options, and rapidly running out of time. The facade of the brilliant, untouchable real estate titan had completely crumbled, leaving behind a terrified, desperate fraud drowning in a sea of insurmountable debt. Sweating profusely and hyperventilating, Cameron collapsed onto the floor of his office, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his professional life. He reached out with trembling, bleeding fingers and picked up his cracked, splintered cell phone from the debris. He stared at the shattered screen, scrolling past the numbers of wealthy investors and elite socialites who would no longer take his calls. His mind, broken by absolute desperation, snapped to the lowest, most pathetic option imaginable. He dialed my number. I sat in my quiet living room watching the caller identification flash on my secondary phone. I answered it, saying absolutely nothing. "Dad," Cameron whispered, his voice shaking violently, completely stripped of all its former arrogance and cruelty. "Dad, please. I am in a really bad spot right now. Can you ask Alicia to let me borrow back that $3,000 she gave you the other day? I just need some cash to pay my employees their weekly salaries. I promise I will pay her back. Please, Dad." I listened to the pathetic, trembling voice of the man I used to call my son. Cameron was begging for the very same $3,000 he had mocked just days prior. He was pleading for his sister's hard-earned cash to save his own skin. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off his desperate whimpering. I set the device face down on the kitchen counter and let the deafening silence of my modest home wash over me. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, calculated peace. I knew Cameron was likely tearing his office apart, trapped in the inescapable cage I had built for him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across my driveway, a sleek, black luxury SUV pulled up to my curb with its headlights deliberately turned off. The engine purred quietly before shutting down. I stood out of sight behind my living room curtains and watched as the driver's side door opened. It was Melanie. She stepped out into the chilly night air wearing a dark trench coat pulled tightly around her waist, looking frantically up and down the empty street. She scurried up my walkway and knocked on my front door with sharp, urgent taps. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Melanie pushed past me without an invitation, her eyes darting around my dimly lit hallway like a cornered animal. She did not bother with her usual fake pleasantries or condescending smiles. She marched straight into my kitchen, unzipped her expensive designer handbag, and pulled out a thick-banded stack of $100 bills. She slammed the crisp currency down onto my wooden dining table with a heavy thud. $5,000, she announced, her breath visible in the cool air of the room. It is cash untraceable, and it is yours to keep right now. I stared at the stack of money resting on my table, then slowly shifted my gaze to my daughter-in-law. The pristine, arrogant socialite who had humiliated me at her dinner table was completely gone. In her place stood a desperate, calculating survivor who had clearly smelled the thick scent of blood in the water. Cameron must have returned to their sprawling mansion completely unhinged, leaking the catastrophic reality of his corporate collapse. Melanie was not a woman who went down with a sinking ship. She was a parasite who instinctively knew when to detach from a dying host. Her affluent Connecticut upbringing had taught her how to ruthlessly protect her own assets, and she was actively preparing her exit strategy. She knew her husband's $20 million project was imploding. She knew the banks had frozen his accounts. What she did not know was that I was the unseen architect of their mutual destruction. Melanie looked at me, misinterpreting my silence for absolute desperation. "I know you need this money for your cancer surgery, Nelson," she said, her voice dripping with a predatory smoothness. "Cameron is losing his mind. He is making erratic, disastrous business decisions, and his firm is bleeding capital. He refused to help you, but I am entirely different. I am stepping up to ensure you get the medical treatment you desperately need. But I am a businesswoman, and I do not hand out $5,000 in cash without securing collateral." I observed her with cold, clinical detachment. This was the same woman who had secretly funneled $150,000 of my stolen home equity to fund her vanity fashion boutique. Now she was offering me a pathetic fraction of my own stolen wealth, attempting to exploit my supposed medical emergency to further enrich herself. She was trying to buy the very roof over my head for pennies, using my impending surgery as a bargaining chip. Melanie reached back into her designer bag and pulled out a crisp, professionally drafted legal document, sliding it across the table to rest right beside the stack of money. It was a quitclaim deed. "Sign the house over to me," she demanded, tapping her manicured fingernail against the signature line. "Directly to my name, not to Cameron. Do not breathe a single word of this to him. He is a sinking stone, and I need to insulate my personal portfolio from his impending bankruptcy." I stared at the legal paper, maintaining my facade of the confused, heartbroken father. "But Melanie," I asked, my voice intentionally wavering, "why would you hide this from your own husband? If his project is failing, shouldn't you be supporting him?" Melanie let out a harsh, utterly humorless laugh that echoed off the kitchen walls. "Support him," she scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Nelson, let us be completely realistic. When his ridiculous project either miraculously succeeds or completely crashes and burns into federal court, I am filing for divorce immediately. I have already consulted my attorneys. I am going to take my rightful half of whatever is left, and this house will serve as my liquid asset to start my life over." I looked at her, widening my eyes to feign deep paternal injury. "I do not understand, Melanie. You stood at an altar. You took holy vows with my son. Do you not love him?" The absolute disdain that flashed across her face was staggering. She rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a vicious, ugly sneer. "Love, please, Nelson. Grow up. I love the prestigious CEO title. I love the country club memberships and the luxury vacations. I love the lifestyle he could provide. But underneath those expensive custom suits, he is just a pathetic, broke black man desperately clinging to his wife's high society connections. There is absolutely nothing to love about a pathetic loser who cannot even keep his own company afloat without begging for extensions. He is a complete fraud, and I am not letting his ghetto roots drag me down into the mud." Her racist, venomous words hung in the air, a vile confirmation of everything I already knew she was. She had never viewed my son as an equal partner. To her, he was merely a diversity trophy that had entirely lost its value. I did not yell. I did not throw her out of my house or condemn her blatant bigotry. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I reached out, picked up the thick stack of $100 bills, and placed them carefully into my pocket. But I used my other hand to slide the blank quitclaim deed right back across the table toward her. "I need to sleep on this. Melanie," I said smoothly, my tone entirely unreadable. "Come back tomorrow." Melanie glared at me, clearly frustrated by my refusal to sign immediately, but she snatched the paper back, confident that my poverty would inevitably break my resolve. "Do not take too long, old man," she spat, turning on her heel and marching out the front door. As soon as her taillights disappeared down the dark street, I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My fingers found the small metallic audio recorder I had activated the moment her car pulled up. I pressed the button ending the high-definition recording. I walked to my computer, uploaded the pristine audio file, and attached it to an encrypted email addressed directly to Oliver. I typed a single decisive sentence before hitting send. "The rat has taken the bait. Prepare everything for the gala. It is time for the final judgment night." The night of the highly publicized $20 million commercial project launch finally arrived. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive convention center was completely transformed into a blinding display of excessive wealth and corporate vanity. A massive crimson-red carpet spilled down the towering marble steps, flanked by heavy velvet ropes and a small army of hired photographers eagerly snapping pictures of the city's financial elite. Valet attendants sprinted back and forth in a frantic frenzy, parking a continuous, dazzling stream of imported luxury sports cars and sleek black limousines. Women draped in sparkling custom designer gowns, and men in razor-sharp tailored tuxedos glided past the heavy brass doors, completely oblivious to the financial bloodbath that was about to occur inside. I stood at the very bottom of those grand marble steps, dressed in the exact same faded navy blue suit I had worn to the Michelin star restaurant earlier that week. Beside me stood Alicia, shivering slightly in the cool evening breeze. She was wearing her simple, everyday winter coat over a modest, off-the-rack dress she had purchased years ago for a church service. We were an absolute jarring anomaly in the sea of extravagant wealth. We did not belong here, and the disdainful, judgmental glances from the passing high society socialites made that fact abundantly clear. The pulsing bass of the live orchestra inside vibrated through the cold pavement beneath my old scuffed dress shoes. This was Cameron's desperate masterpiece, his final frantic illusion designed to blind his wealthy investors and satisfy the violent underground loan sharks closing in on his massive debt. He had thrown every last stolen cent into creating this magnificent facade, completely unaware that I was standing at the front door, holding the match that would burn it all to the ground. Alicia tightly gripped my arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound confusion and mounting anxiety. "Dad, why on earth are we here?" she whispered, shrinking back as a group of wealthy venture capitalists brushed past us with sneering, arrogant looks. Cameron made it perfectly clear we were not invited to this gala. We do not even have tickets to get past the lobby. If he or Melanie see us standing out here on the red carpet, they are going to cause a massive scene. We are going to get humiliated in front of all these people. Please let us just go back home before security sees us." I looked down at my daughter, the incredible woman who had sacrificed her own transportation, jeopardized her children's education, and worked herself to the bone on graveyard hospital shifts just to ensure I survived my cancer surgery. I remembered the exact sickening sound of her body hitting the hardwood floor when Cameron struck her in his office. A cold, righteous fury settled deep inside my chest, but my physical demeanor remained an absolute fortress of calm. I reached out and gently placed my calloused hand over hers, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. "You listened to me very carefully, Alicia," I said, my voice steady and vibrating with absolute, unbreakable certainty. "For your entire life, you have been pushed to the shadows. You have been mocked, belittled, and treated like a second-class citizen by your own brother and his deeply racist, parasitic wife. You have carried the heavy weight of this family while they stole the very foundation right out from under us. We are not going back home. We are not running away. We are standing right here because tonight the shadows are finally coming into the blazing light. Tonight I am going to tear down the fraudulent empire he built on your suffering, and I am going to hand you the exact justice you have always deserved. Do not lower your head to anyone tonight." Before Alicia could fully process my promise, the heavy brass doors at the top of the marble stairs swung violently open. Cameron stepped out onto the landing holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne flanked by his beautiful, treacherous wife. Melanie was draped in a breathtaking emerald silk gown, diamonds glittering fiercely against her collarbone under the bright flashing lights. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by a wealthy investor playing the role of the perfect, adoring corporate wife to absolute perfection. But the exact moment her eyes swept down the long red carpet and locked onto us, her radiant, practiced smile shattered into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She violently tapped Cameron on the shoulder, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. Cameron's face instantly drained of all color, immediately followed by a flush of absolute terrifying rage. He slammed his champagne glass onto a passing waiter's silver tray and marched aggressively down the marble steps, Melanie trailing closely behind him, like a venomous shadow. "What is the matter with you?" Cameron hissed, his voice a low, lethal growl, deliberately designed to avoid the attention of the surrounding press photographers. "Are you completely insane? I told you to stay away from me." Melanie stepped forward, her face twisted in absolute disgust as she looked Alicia up and down, taking in her modest coat and simple shoes. "I cannot believe you actually showed up here dressed like absolute garbage," Melanie spat, her voice dripping with sheer, unfiltered malice. "This is a highly exclusive, multi-million-dollar corporate event. You two look like you just crawled out of a filthy homeless shelter. You are actively trying to sabotage my husband's career by parading your pathetic poverty in front of our elite guests." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, letting their vile insults bounce off my invisible armor. I simply smiled, a dark, knowing smirk that only infuriated my son further. Security Cameron roared, finally losing his precious, carefully manicured corporate composure. Two massive, broad-shouldered security guards in black suits immediately sprinted over from the velvet ropes. "Grab these two beggars and drag them off the premises immediately," Cameron commanded, pointing a shaking, furious finger at me. "Throw them out into the street where they belong. They are trespassing and they are going to ruin my pristine red carpet." The two massive security guards lunged forward, their heavy hands aggressively grabbing my arms to forcefully drag me down the pavement. Alicia screamed in absolute terror, desperately trying to pull the guards away from me. But before they could drag me a single inch, a sleek, elongated black limousine pulled up smoothly to the absolute front of the red carpet, completely blocking the flow of elite traffic. The rear door swung open and Oliver stepped out into the blinding, flashing camera lights. He was dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored tuxedo, projecting an aura of immense, undeniable legal and financial power. He marched straight up the red carpet, ignoring the chaos, holding a solid gold, heavily embossed VIP access card high in the air. "Take your hands off him." This exact second, Oliver's voice boomed over the chaotic crowd, echoing with such fierce authority that it stopped the seasoned security guards dead in their tracks. "Excuse me, but this man is the highest-level guest of honor tonight. He is the primary stakeholder of this entire corporate event. Who dares touch him?" Cameron completely froze, his mouth falling open as absolute paralyzing shock locked his rigid body firmly in place. The security guards immediately released my arms, stepping back as if they had just touched burning coal. Oliver gestured toward the grand entrance, completely ignoring the pale, trembling forms of Cameron and Melanie. I offered Alicia my arm, and we walked right past my stunned son, stepping onto the plush crimson carpet as if we owned the building. We were escorted by the event organizers through the heavy brass doors and directly into the opulent main ballroom. Waiters in crisp white jackets wove through tables adorned with towering floral centerpieces and crystal champagne flutes. Oliver guided us to the absolute front row, pointing to a reserved circular table situated directly beneath the stage. A small gold placard rested on the silk tablecloth. It read, "Reserved for Apex Holdings." I pulled out a chair for Alicia, who sat down with wide, disbelieving eyes, and then I took my seat. The lights in the massive ballroom began to dim, signaling the start of the evening's main presentation. A heavy, suffocating tension filled the air as Cameron was introduced over the loudspeaker. He stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and approached the grand acrylic podium. The confident, arrogant titan of real estate was completely gone. His face was glistening with cold sweat under the harsh stage lights. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting frantically toward my table. When he opened his mouth to begin his multi-million-dollar capital pitch to the room of elite venture capitalists, his voice cracked. He stammered, shuffling his index cards, desperately trying to project the illusion of a successful corporate visionary while knowing his absolute worst nightmare was sitting 10 feet away. I sat perfectly still in my chair, resting my hands on the table, watching him drown in real time. My posture was not that of a fragile, cancer-stricken senior citizen begging for scraps. I sat with the rigid, calculated discipline of a seasoned military general surveying an active battlefield. I observed the crowd of wealthy socialites and ruthless hedge fund managers surrounding us. These were the people Cameron sold his soul to impress. These were the elites who sipped expensive imported wine while casually destroying blue-collar neighborhoods to build luxury retail spaces. My son had completely abandoned his heritage, his family, and his own moral compass just to earn a seat at their mahogany tables. He had lied about his background, fabricated his wealth, and borrowed millions from violent underground criminals, all to maintain this fragile, glittering facade. And now he was standing on that stage weaving a desperate tapestry of lies to secure the final round of investor funding he needed to save his life. He clicked a button and a massive digital projection of the proposed commercial complex illuminated the screen behind him. He spoke rapidly, tossing around inflated profit margins and guaranteed return rates, trying to hypnotize the wealthy audience into handing over their capital. He claimed the foundation was secure, the permits were cleared, and the ground lease was firmly under his corporate control. Every single word echoing through the ballroom speakers was an absolute verifiable lie. Beside me, Alicia watched her brother with a mixture of profound sadness and newfound clarity. She finally saw the pathetic, terrified boy hiding behind the custom-tailored tuxedo. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. A true soldier knows that when an enemy builds their entire fortress on a foundation of deceit, you do not need to attack the walls. You simply wait for the ground beneath them to inevitably collapse. Cameron raised his hands, attempting to rally the crowd for the final critical investment pitch. "Gentlemen," he projected, forcing a charismatic smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "This $20 million development is not just a building, it is a legacy. We are offering you a guaranteed ground floor entry into the most lucrative commercial space this city has seen in a decade. The land is perfectly situated, and our firm is ready to break ground the moment this final funding round closes." He paused, waiting for the polite applause and the inevitable raising of investment paddles. But the applause never came. Instead, the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom was broken by the sharp screech of a chair being pushed back from a prominent VIP table across the aisle. A tall, silver-haired man stood up. It was Richard, the billionaire venture capitalist I had secretly recorded at the Michelin star restaurant just nights before. He was the largest institutional investor in the room, the primary whale Cameron desperately needed to pay off his dangerous black market debts. Richard casually buttoned his suit jacket, his expression entirely unreadable, and stared directly at the stage. "Cameron," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed, cavernous room without the need for a microphone. "You have presented a very compelling architectural rendering. You claim this project is highly viable and practically guaranteed to generate massive returns." Cameron swallowed hard, nodding frantically. "Yes, absolutely, Richard. Our projections are completely rock solid." Richard tilted his head slightly, a cold, predatory gleam in his eye. "That is incredibly fascinating," he replied smoothly. "Because my legal team conducted a routine due diligence check this afternoon. We heard a very disturbing rumor circulating through the financial district. We heard that the actual owner of the dirt you are planning to build upon a private entity, known as Apex Holdings, is not experiencing bankruptcy as you previously claimed. In fact, we heard they are actively preparing to reclaim this entire parcel of land due to severe, catastrophic financial defaults on your corporate lease." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the crowd of elite investors. Whispers erupted at every table. Cameron turned the color of ash, his jaw dropping open as he struggled to form a coherent sentence. Richard raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. He looked around the ballroom. "Furthermore, I was reliably informed that the primary executive representative of Apex Holdings is actually in attendance tonight. Before we commit a single dollar of our capital to your firm, we want to hear directly from the landowner. We want to hear his exact opinion on the future of this project." The entire ballroom descended into an absolute, breathless silence. The heavy velvet curtains seemed to absorb the tension as hundreds of wealthy investors began frantically looking around the room, trying to identify the mysterious corporate titan who held the ultimate fate of the $20 million project in his hands. Cameron looked like he was about to physically collapse behind the acrylic podium. Up in the lighting booth, the technical director followed a pre-arranged cue from Oliver. The main house lights plunged into total darkness. A single blindingly bright white spotlight cut through the pitch-black room. The beam of light swept rapidly across the crowded tables, skipping over the confused faces of the city's elite until it stopped and locked directly onto me. I sat in the brilliant circle of light for a brief, calculated moment. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up to my full height. I calmly reached down and buttoned the front of my faded, worn-out navy blue suit vest. With absolute majestic authority, I turned and began my slow, deliberate walk up the marble steps to the main stage. I climbed the marble steps to the main stage, my worn leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished stone. Every single eye in the massive, opulent ballroom was locked onto my faded navy blue suit. The deafening chatter from the city elite had instantly evaporated, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Cameron was frozen behind the clear acrylic podium, his mouth hanging open, his face dripping with cold, terrified sweat. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, commanding posture of a military general stepping onto a conquered battlefield. I reached the center of the stage and calmly reached out, pulling the microphone directly from its heavy chrome stand. The harsh glare of the spotlight followed my every move, blindingly bright, but I did not blink or turn away. I looked out over the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthiest venture capitalists in the room. Then my gaze shifted to my son, who looked as though he was staring at a terrifying ghost. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, shaking the very crystal on the chandeliers above us. "I am Nelson Holloway," I declared, letting the sheer weight of my name settle over the breathless crowd. "I am the man this so-called CEO tried to banish from the red carpet just moments ago. I am his father." I paused, letting the shock ripple through the front rows before delivering the absolute crushing truth. "And I am also the sole undisputed owner and primary executive stakeholder of Apex Holdings." A collective deafening gasp erupted from the hundreds of wealthy investors. The sound of shifting chairs and frantic whispers instantly filled the cavernous space. It was the distinct sound of a massive, glittering illusion shattering into a million jagged pieces. Cameron's knees completely buckled beneath him. He staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest by a heavy sledgehammer. His shoulder violently hit the edge of the acrylic podium, knocking the microphone stand over with a loud, piercing screech of feedback. He collapsed onto the hardwood stage floor, his designer tuxedo bunching up around him, his hands desperately clawing at his own hair. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as the absolute reality of his destruction finally caught up to him. The blind trust I had established decades ago to protect him from the corrupting influence of generational wealth was now the exact instrument of his total financial execution. Down in the front row, Alicia had both hands clamped tightly over her mouth. Tears of profound shock and overwhelming realization streamed down her face. She looked at me standing in the spotlight, then at the terrified shell of her brother whimpering on the floor, finally understanding the true magnitude of the secret I had been guarding all these years. She realized that the father she had sold her only car to save the man she had fiercely protected from a ruthless eviction was secretly sitting on an empire. She had passed the ultimate test of character, proving her pure heart, while her brother had spectacularly failed. The rich elites in the audience were now standing up on their toes, craning their necks to witness the unprecedented corporate slaughter unfolding right in front of their eyes. Melanie was frozen at her VIP table, her emerald silk gown suddenly looking like a cheap, ridiculous costume, as the reality of her husband's absolute ruin washed over her arrogant face. I did not give Cameron a single second to recover his breath or attempt a pathetic defense. I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, encrypted digital flash drive. I tossed it effortlessly to the technical director hovering in the stage wing, who immediately plugged it into the main projection system. The massive 20-foot digital screen behind me, which had previously displayed Cameron's fabricated architectural renderings, instantly switched to a glaring, high-resolution display of certified legal documents. "Look closely at the screen, ladies and gentlemen," I commanded, pointing a steady finger at the damning evidence towering above us. "This man has been aggressively pitching you a $20 million commercial development. But the truth is, he does not own the dirt beneath his polished shoes, and he has severely defaulted on his commercial ground lease." The screen flashed to the official notice of default from Apex Holdings, clearly showing the $2 million in unpaid overdue rent. The crowd murmured in absolute outrage as I gestured for the next slide. "But his corporate failures are the absolute least of his crimes," I continued, my voice echoing with righteous, unrelenting fury. "To fund his failing vanity projects and keep up his pathetic charade of wealth, this man resorted to robbing his own family." The massive screen shifted again, displaying the fraudulent home equity line of credit side by side with a forensic analysis of his forged signature. He secretly stole $150,000 in equity from my modest residential home, wiring the stolen funds directly into his wife's luxury fashion boutique. He left me to face an illegal bank foreclosure while popping imported champagne with all of you. Cameron let out a pathetic, animalistic whimper from the floor, trying to shield his face from the glaring projection lights. But I was not finished dismantling him. The final document flashed onto the massive screen. It was the official court petition for emergency legal guardianship. When I was diagnosed with prostate cancer and needed a life-saving surgery, he refused to help me. I stated my voice completely devoid of any paternal mercy. Instead, he hired a corrupt, bribed psychiatrist and filed this legal petition to declare me mentally incompetent. He wanted to strip away my civil rights, lock me in a state-funded charity ward, and legally hijack the remainder of my assets to pay off the $5 million he currently owes to violent underground loan sharks. A wave of profound revulsion swept through the ballroom. I looked down at my son delivering the final fatal blow. He has no $20 million project. He has no corporate empire. He is nothing but a desperate, debt-ridden thief. Richard, the silver-haired billionaire venture capitalist standing in the center aisle, violently hurled his crystal champagne flute directly onto the marble floor. The glass shattered into hundreds of sparkling fragments, the sharp, explosive sound cutting through the stunned, breathless silence of the grand ballroom. "Cameron, you are an absolute fraud," Richard roared, his face flushed with uncontrollable righteous fury. "My firm is pulling out immediately, and I am personally calling the federal authorities regarding your fabricated financial disclosures tonight." As if triggered by a massive, invisible shockwave, every single elite investor in the room simultaneously stood up from their tables. The wealthy socialites and ruthless hedge fund managers turned their backs on the stage in sheer, unadulterated disgust. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as the entire room moved en masse toward the grand exit doors. They were aggressively withdrawing their capital, their support, and their association. In a matter of agonizing seconds, the glamorous $20 million commercial project completely vanished into thin air, leaving Cameron weeping on the floor of a rapidly emptying room. The grand ballroom dissolved into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The frantic scraping of heavy wooden chairs and the muffled shouts of panicked investors scrambling for the exit doors echoed harshly off the vaulted ceilings. Wealthy executives were furiously dialing their financial managers on their cell phones, aggressively demanding that all pending wire transfers to Cameron's firm be canceled immediately. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the magnificent collapse of a counterfeit empire unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. Cameron was still crumpled on the floor, his hands covering his ears, as if trying to physically block out the reality of his total financial destruction. He was whimpering, a broken shell of the arrogant corporate titan who had dismissed my cancer diagnosis just weeks prior. Then a flash of bright emerald silk darted through the frantic crowd. It was Melanie. She hiked up the skirt of her custom designer gown, abandoning all her refined grace, and practically sprinted up the marble steps of the stage. Her carefully curated, arrogant composure was entirely gone, replaced by a highly theatrical mask of sheer desperate terror. She threw herself toward me, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, playing the role of the innocent, victimized wife to absolute perfection. "Nelson, please," she sobbed loudly, ensuring her voice carried toward the investors still lingering near the exit doors. "You have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea about any of this. Cameron lied to me, just like he lied to you and all these wealthy investors. He manipulated our entire marriage from the very beginning. I did not know a single thing about the underground loans or the forged bank signatures. I swear to you on my life. I am just as much of a victim here as you are." She reached out, attempting to grab my arm with trembling hands, putting on a masterful, sickening performance of profound betrayal. I looked down at her grasping, manicured fingers, feeling a deep physical revulsion that chilled my blood. Melanie was not crying for my stolen money, nor was she shedding tears for her husband's impending federal incarceration. She was weeping exclusively for her shattered social standing and her impending bankruptcy. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted her wealthy elite parents standing rigidly near the front row of the chaotic ballroom. The prestigious Connecticut socialites who had openly scoffed at my presence on the red carpet and treated Alicia like an uneducated servant were now staring at their daughter in absolute horror. Melanie knew her entire upper-class existence was evaporating by the second. Without Cameron's fabricated CEO status and the stolen funds secretly funneling into her fashion boutique, she would be completely ostracized from her exclusive country club circles. The other wealthy wives would tear her reputation to shreds over their expensive brunches. To salvage whatever pathetic shred of dignity she had left in front of her horrified family, she was actively throwing the man she married directly into the blazing fire. She wanted to cleanly detach herself from the sinking ship, painting Cameron as a rogue criminal mastermind who had secretly hijacked her pristine, privileged life. She believed that if she cried hard enough and played the devastated, clueless spouse, she could retreat to her parents' sprawling estate and emerge totally unscathed. She thought I was just a naive, forgiving old man who would take pity on a weeping woman in a designer dress. She completely forgot the crucial lesson she should have learned when she slinked into my house demanding the deed to my property in exchange for my cancer surgery funds. I do not forget, and I absolutely do not forgive traitors who smile in my face while holding a knife to my back. I did not speak a single word of comfort to her. I did not pull my arm away or shout in anger. Instead, I calmly reached into the breast pocket of my faded navy suit jacket and pulled out the small metallic audio recorder I had used during her secret extortionist visit to my house. I walked deliberately toward the audio technician's mixing board situated right beside the acrylic podium. With smooth, practiced precision, I plugged the device directly into the main auxiliary port of the ballroom's massive state-of-the-art surround sound system. Melanie stopped crying instantly, her fake tears drying up as a look of genuine, paralyzing confusion washed over her face. I pressed the play button. A split second later, Melanie's own cold, venomous voice blasted through the towering speakers vibrating off the crystal chandeliers with pristine, undeniable clarity. "Sign the house over to me," her recorded voice demanded aggressively, filling the silent voids of the room. "Directly to my name, not to Cameron. Do not breathe a single word of this to him. He is a sinking stone, and I need to insulate my personal portfolio from his impending bankruptcy." The remaining crowd in the ballroom stopped dead in their tracks, turning back to face the stage. Cameron slowly looked up from the floor, his red, tear-filled eyes locking onto his wife in sheer, devastating disbelief. He had betrayed his own father, stolen from his family, and ruined his life to give this woman the world, and she had planned to discard him the second the money dried up. But the recording was not finished. It continued broadcasting her vicious, unvarnished racism to the entire room. "Love, please, Nelson. Grow up. I love the prestigious CEO title, but underneath those expensive custom suits he is just a pathetic, broke black man desperately clinging to his wife's high society connections. There is absolutely nothing to love about a pathetic loser. I am not letting his ghetto roots drag me down into the mud." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Melanie stood frozen on the stage, the emerald silk of her dress suddenly looking like a prison uniform, the color entirely drained from her face, leaving her completely ashen and trembling uncontrollably. I looked down at her elite parents in the front row. The deep burning humiliation on their faces was palpable. Their pristine generational reputation had just been publicly annihilated by their own daughter's grotesque bigotry and corporate extortion. Her father turned his back without a single word of defense. Her mother covered her face with a clutch purse, and together they briskly walked out of the ballroom, completely abandoning her to the disaster she had engineered. Melanie reached out toward them, her mouth opening and closing silently, but they did not even look back. She was entirely alone, stripped of her wealth, her pride, and her family. The crushing weight of her public destruction was suddenly amplified by a piercing, high-pitched wail echoing from the city streets outside. The unmistakable shriek of heavy police sirens tore through the cool night air, multiplying rapidly until the deafening sound completely surrounded the convention center. Flashing red and blue lights painted the tall glass windows of the lobby. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with explosive, undeniable force. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets marked with bold yellow FBI lettering stormed into the grand foyer, flanked closely by armed financial crimes investigators. They marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, their heavy boots thundering against the polished marble floor, cutting through the remaining crowd of stunned onlookers. 2 federal agents swiftly ascended the stage stairs, completely ignoring the scattered debris of the destroyed gala. The lead agent pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs, his eyes locking coldly onto my son and daughter-in-law. Cameron and Melanie Holloway, he announced, his voice carrying the final undeniable weight of federal justice. You are both under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around their wrists echoed loudly through the room, finalizing the absolute destruction of their fraudulent empire. Exactly 7 days after the FBI raided the Grand Ballroom, the spectacular ruins of Cameron's fabricated life were put on full display for the entire city to witness. He had managed to secure a temporary release on bail pending his federal trial for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, but freedom outside a jail cell offered him absolutely no comfort. The federal authorities had systematically frozen every single one of his bank accounts and seized his sprawling mansion in the gated community. Melanie, true to her vicious, self-serving nature, had immediately filed for a swift, aggressive divorce the moment her own legal team secured her separate bail, publicly throwing him under the bus to save her own skin. With his luxury cars impounded, his corporate headquarters shuttered, and his elite socialite friends aggressively screening his calls, the mighty CEO was completely, undeniably homeless. The cold, biting wind of reality drove him to the only place he had left. Late on a Tuesday afternoon, heavy, desperate knocks rattled the front door of my modest single-story house. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Cameron was standing on my cracked concrete porch, shivering in a wrinkled, unwashed gray sweater that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The moment his bloodshot, exhausted eyes met mine, his legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees on the hard pavement, burying his face in his trembling hands, and began to weep with the loud, agonizing sobs of a man who had finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his own destruction. I stood quietly in the doorway, leaning slightly on my wooden cane, and stared down at the broken, shivering figure on my porch. There was a time not so long ago when the sight of my son crying would have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I would have instantly dropped to my knees beside him, pulled him into my arms, and moved heaven and earth to fix whatever was hurting him. I would have taken an extra night shift at the post office, sold my remaining possessions, and sacrificed my own health just to put a smile back on his face. But as I looked at him now stripped of his expensive custom suits and his suffocating arrogance, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, unconditional well of paternal love I had reserved exclusively for him had been completely drained. He had poisoned that well the night he laughed at my cancer diagnosis, and he had permanently cemented it shut when he tried to strip away my legal autonomy. The hollow emptiness in my chest was not born out of malice or a petty desire for revenge. It was the solemn, heavy realization that I was no longer looking at my child. I was looking at a convicted predator experiencing the brutal, inescapable consequences of his own insatiable greed. He had spent his entire adult life measuring human worth in dollar amounts, actively discarding the people who genuinely loved him to impress elite strangers who vanished the second his bank accounts hit zero. He had been taught a profoundly expensive lesson, and the tuition cost him absolutely everything he valued. "Dad, please," Cameron sobbed, his voice cracking as he looked up at me with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The feds took the house, they took the company, Melanie left me, and her lawyers are trying to pin the entire fraud scheme on me. I do not even have enough cash to buy a hot meal or hire a decent defense attorney. Please, Dad. I am so sorry. I was blind. I was stupid. Just let me stay in my old room. I will do anything you ask. I will work it off. Just please do not leave me out here on the street." I looked down at him, my expression a flawless mask of cold, unbreakable stone. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or kick him while he was down. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that cut straight through the freezing wind. "Do you remember the night I called you from my car, Cameron?" I asked, my voice steady and merciless. I had just been diagnosed with prostate cancer. I was terrified. I begged you for $5,600 to secure a life-saving surgery. You told me you were too busy popping champagne with your wealthy investors to care about my survival. You told me I was a failure who needed to rely on government charity. Cameron flinched as if I had physically struck him, fresh tears pouring down his pale cheeks. "Dad, I was stressed. I was drowning in debt. I did not mean it. I did not care about your debt," I replied, my tone dropping to an icy whisper. "I cared about my life, and you chose to leave me to die." You slammed the door shut when I needed $5,600 to fight for my very life. You tried to steal this very house out from under me and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to save your own skin. You made your choices, and now the universe is handing you the bill. Your $20 million party is officially over, Cameron. Now you will pay the price for your own greed. I stepped back into the warmth of my hallway, and without a single ounce of hesitation, I firmly pulled the heavy wooden door shut, the sharp click of the deadbolt echoing with absolute finality. I turned my back to the front door, completely ignoring the muffled, frantic pounding and the pathetic wails coming from the porch outside. I walked slowly down the hallway and stepped into my modest living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the bay windows, casting a warm golden glow across the dining table. Alicia was sitting there, dressed in a sharp professional blazer, her posture radiating a newfound undeniable confidence. Across from her sat Oliver, his leather briefcase open with a thick stack of immaculate legal documents meticulously arranged on the wooden surface. Oliver handed me a solid gold fountain pen with a respectful nod. I took the pen, sat down next to the daughter who had willingly sacrificed her own survival to save mine, and signed my name on the very last dotted line. With that single stroke of ink, I officially transferred the total irrevocable executive control of the entire Apex Trust empire directly to Alicia. Exactly 1 year later, the gentle, rhythmic lapping of pristine water against the wooden beams of a private dock was the only sound breaking the serene morning silence. I sat in a comfortable padded deck chair holding a carbon fiber fishing rod loosely in my hands, watching the golden sun slowly rise over the towering pine trees. The crisp, clean air filled my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I breathed without a single trace of physical or emotional pain. My medical chart sitting on the kitchen counter of my sprawling new estate carried the greatest news a man my age could ever hope to receive. I was completely, unequivocally in remission. The aggressive prostate cancer that had threatened to end my life, the very same illness my son had callously told me to finance through government charity, had been entirely eradicated. The top-tier oncologists paid securely and anonymously through the vast resources of the Apex Trust had performed a flawless surgery and monitored my recovery with absolute precision. My body had healed, my strength had fully returned, and the heavy, suffocating shadow of death had been permanently lifted from my shoulders. The magnificent waterfront property I now called home was a far cry from the modest, drafty house Cameron had desperately tried to steal. It was a vast, secure sanctuary, surrounded by acres of lush, private forest purchased outright in cash by the new executive director of my empire. The heavy glass sliding doors of the main house opened smoothly, and Alicia walked out onto the wooden deck carrying 2 steaming mugs of fresh black coffee. She handed me a cup, pressing a warm, affectionate kiss to the top of my head before sitting in the chair beside me. The transformation in my daughter over the past 12 months was nothing short of miraculous. The exhausted, overworked nurse who used to shiver in threadbare scrubs at 2 in the morning was entirely gone. In her place sat a brilliant, fiercely intelligent CEO dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored designer pantsuit. When I handed her the keys to Apex Holdings, she did not squander the opportunity or let the immense corporate power inflate her ego. Instead, she took the sprawling real estate trust and injected it with a profound, unwavering sense of humanity. She ruthlessly fired the stagnant, complacent board members and maximized the commercial lease revenues across the city. But she did not use those massive profits to buy imported sports cars or throw lavish, meaningless galas to impress shallow socialites. She used the immense wealth of Apex Holdings to establish the Holloway Senior Medical Endowment. It was a massive multi-million-dollar charitable foundation specifically designed to cover the exorbitant out-of-pocket insurance deductibles for vulnerable low-income elderly patients facing life-threatening illnesses. Every single week, her foundation quietly paid the exact $5,600 hospital deposits that Cameron had so viciously mocked me for needing. She was saving hundreds of lives, protecting the most fragile members of our society from the terrifying predatory greed of the modern healthcare system. She had conquered the corporate world not with ruthlessness, but with profound, weaponized kindness. Miles away from our peaceful lakeside estate, in the bustling, unforgiving center of the downtown financial district, a very different reality was playing out under the scorching midday sun. Cameron had narrowly avoided a lengthy federal prison sentence, but his freedom came at an incredibly humiliating, devastating price. Facing an insurmountable mountain of evidence regarding his corporate embezzlement and wire fraud, he was forced to accept a brutal plea deal. He had to turn state's evidence testifying in open court against the violent underground loan sharks and corrupt bankers who had facilitated his fraudulent empire. In exchange for his cooperation, the judge stripped him of every single financial asset he possessed, ordered millions in permanent restitution, and sentenced him to 5 years of rigorous, heavily supervised probation. But the judge also mandated thousands of hours of grueling manual community service. And through a twist of profound poetic justice silently arranged by Oliver's legal team, Cameron was assigned to a municipal beautification crew responsible for cleaning commercial properties in the downtown sector. Right now, Cameron was wearing a stiff, heavily soiled, bright orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit. He held a cheap, splintering wooden push broom in his blistered hands, aggressively sweeping broken glass, discarded food wrappers, and filthy debris off the cracked concrete pavement. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes as he labored under the intense heat. The brutal irony of his assigned location was inescapable. He was physically cleaning the exact same prime commercial real estate lot owned by Apex Holdings. This was the very dirt he had once stood upon in a custom-tailored tuxedo, arrogantly boasting to wealthy venture capitalists about his magnificent $20 million corporate development. The towering glass skyscrapers and luxury retail stores he had promised his elite investors were nothing but a humiliating hallucination. Now the wealthy socialites and powerful hedge fund managers he had desperately sold his soul to impress drove past him in their sleek European sedans, refusing to even glance in his direction. Melanie had finalized their vicious, highly publicized divorce months ago, completely abandoning him to the legal wolves while she fled the state to hide in her parents' Connecticut basement. Cameron was entirely alone, stripped of his fake CEO title, his mansion, and his dignity. He paused his sweeping for a brief second, leaning heavily against the broom handle, staring blankly at the bustling city traffic. The absolute crushing realization that he had traded his devoted family and his own father's life for a temporary fragile illusion of wealth was permanently etched into his exhausted, defeated face. He was finally paying the full, agonizing price for his insatiable greed, forced to manually scrub the very empire he had tried to steal. Back on the tranquil wooden deck of our private estate, a sudden burst of joyful, energetic laughter snapped me out of my quiet reflection. I turned my head and watched Alicia's 2 teenage sons sprinting across the manicured green lawn, expertly tossing a football back and forth under the clear blue sky. They were thriving. Their overdue tuition had been paid in full, their college funds were irrevocably secured, and they were growing into strong, honorable young men who deeply respected their mother's incredible sacrifices. Alicia smiled brightly, watching her boys play, her eyes reflecting a deep, unshakable peace. I leaned back in my comfortable chair, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee, letting the absolute perfection of the moment wash over my soul. The long, agonizing war was finally over, and the natural order of the world had been rightfully restored. I looked out over the sparkling water, a profound, undeniable truth settling firmly in my mind. Money does not change a person's fundamental nature. It never has. It merely strips away the polite, carefully constructed masks they wear and amplifies exactly what is already hiding in their heart. It gives a greedy man the power to destroy himself, and it gives a good woman the tools to heal the world. I had lost an arrogant, ungrateful son to the toxic, blinding allure of high society. But in return, I had discovered a brilliant, worthy successor who had earned her crown through pure, unselfish love. The Holloway legacy was finally in the right hands, and my life was infinitely richer than it had ever been before. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this pain is the sheer power of silence. When people underestimate you, they hand you their entire playbook. Cameron looked at me and saw nothing but a frail old man to be discarded. He never realized that true strength does not need to shout or throw tantrums. True strength sits, quietly observes the enemy, and waits for the exact perfect moment to strike. Never mistake patience for weakness, and never underestimate a parent who has spent their entire life quietly sacrificing in the shadows. The loudest, arrogant voices are usually the easiest to topple. If you enjoyed my story of ultimate justice, please leave a comment down below and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to never underestimate quiet strength.